So welcome everyone. Today is day 2 of the 2025 Grant Summit. We are really excited to be getting to do this event, and day 1 was awesome. It was really great hearing all the different conversations, the fireside chats, the presentations, and today is yet another packed day of exciting conversation. So I'm just going to set the stage a little bit before getting the first presentation going at 10 minutes after the hour with one of our own researchers, Mike Cooper. But before I get into today's schedule, I will not be rehashing my full bio. Please feel free to jump back to yesterday's recording if that's of interest. I did want to make sure to plug the Grant Innovation Lab at MetaGov, which is the specific team within MetaGov that has been organizing this event, that has produced the various research that is linked to on the screen, and organized some events in the past. This QR code will take you to our website, grant.metagov.org, where you can click into any of our work and where we will update, projects, and we'll link to these streams once they are uploaded on YouTube as well. So, being very honest, we were kind of shocked and blown away by the amount of interest in the form of views yesterday. It was roughly 5x, almost 6x my personal expectation. So it's really cool to see just how much interest and excitement there is around this topic. And we really hope to continue to both do research on the one hand. So, if you are someone who is interested in collaborating on the research side, please feel free to reach out to us. But also, we really want to make sure that we're serving the broad community. We've organized a community of grant operators. We try to connect with the grantees that we know, but we're also really trying to figure out how we can better serve the grantee community around Web3. So from that perspective, if you have specific thoughts, if you're excited by the kind of topics we're talking about yesterday and today, but you feel like, hey, actually, here's some concrete suggestions on how you could better help the grantee group within Web3, ecosystem agnostic, please let us know. That's something that's very much on our minds and that we want to collaborate with more. So please do just keep us posted there. And we're always welcome feedback and constructive criticism. So yeah, if there's more of what you want to see, anything that we can do better, please don't be shy in reaching out. I do also want to take a moment to thank the wonderful contributors of the Grant Innovation Lab team who you can see here. Everyone here has contributed in various ways in making this event a reality. It always takes a village when it comes to live events, even if this one is virtual, and so obviously has less overhead than the full live events. But nonetheless, this took a big effort, and so yeah, major thank you to everyone who you see here: Anke from Stellar, Ben, Feems, Josh, Michelle, and the Octant crew, Mike, Rashmi, and Sam. So we have a bunch of wonderful contributors from across the space. I want to make sure to give a special shout out to Josh, who is an intern with us for the summer, who has been doing a lot of the work. Feems, who has really helped with a lot of shaping the current programming, as did everyone who's on this slide. And and the Octant crew and yourself, the viewers, for all of the wonderful contributions to this event. It wouldn't be possible without y'all, so we really appreciate it. I also want to take a quick moment to just share a little bit about MetaGov again, in case you're unaware. MetaGov is a governance research nonprofit based out of the States, and we look at decentralized governance broadly. So this is not a group that's exclusively focused on Web3. We have research directors looking at AI governance or commons governance or just decentralized community, whether digital or physical governance. And, MetaGov really strives to be this laboratory for digital governance, especially. So that is kind of the sweet spot where a lot of the focus actually is. So if you haven't come across MetaGov and you consider yourself a governance enthusiast or a gov geek, please do check out the community. This QR code will bring you to metagov.org, which is our website, which you could see with the wonderful iframes design here. And yeah, you could see our different projects. You could learn more about our weekly seminars. You could get to join the Slack. So yeah, do feel free to hop into the MetaGov website to learn more. And yeah, these are just some of the wonderful team members and contributors. There's too many to fit in a single screenshot. But yeah, we are really excited to continue to engage with folks across the board when it comes to decentralized governance. So yesterday was a jam-packed day with so many wonderful conversations. I got to start off the day hosting a fireside chat with Alex Obaja from ARIA, which is the UK equivalent to DARPA for those who are familiar in the States. And that was a really fun conversation, just getting to jam a little bit on research organizations and mechanism design from the perspective of these kind of large-scale funders. Then we also had wonderful conversations, and hey, Avas, we also had wonderful conversations or presentations from Anke talking about designing grants and really helping think through the various aspects of the process. Federico from the EF joined to talk about the kind of revised EF grant structure, along with as part of many of the other revisions happening at the EF at the moment. Themes was presenting some of their research in terms of strategy in funding and capital design and the CAMP framework that she developed. We also had Robbie from Endowment in conversation with Mike talking about passive quadratic funding to decentralized philanthropy. And they really just talked about various aspects of this intersection of philanthropy and Web3 and the kind of mechanisms that are both onboarding, traditional philanthropic funders, but also some of the new and exciting elements that Web3 can add to that. That was followed by Mishal presenting on the Octant Accelerator and both talking about some of the specifics of the program there, as well as generally thinking about accelerators as a grant operator. We had Joel talk through some of the research that he's done and some of the experience at Gitcoin specifically, and the intersection there of this kind of fair collective decision-making through plurality and some of the different QF models, quadratic funding models there. We had Vaughn from Butter in conversation with our teammate Ben, talking about grants, markets, futarchy, and kind of what the future might look like in that direction. JB Rubinovitz joined to talk about AI do's and don'ts, which is obviously a hot topic these days, before Kush and Themes closed out the day with filling the gap and specifically talking about funding in Latin America. So if you were excited by the conversations yesterday, we will be posting the videos up on YouTube. You can still go back on Twitter, if I'm not mistaken. And we have a jam-packed day today as well. We're going to be kicking off with Mike from the MetaGov team talking about some of the research that he's been doing as part of this Grant Impact Handbook project that we currently have going on. And we'll be generally talking about using the use of evidence in Web3 decision-making. We're going to have a panel talking about various aspects of grantee success. We'll have conversations about scaling democratic participation, the work that then a presentation from DAOstar on some of the intelligence layer for Web3 grants. We're going to hear from Monty from the ReFi community with the impact measurement data standard that he's working on, as well as some research projects showcased on the quantitative analysis of Web3 grant data, understanding the real world impact from the Stellar Community Fund. We're going to hear from Angela from TE Academy about some of the metrics-based grants and verifiable impact work that they're doing there. We're going to hear from Ken from Mercy Corps about crypto for good and kind of talking about some of the realities of working in the global south there, as well as a presentation from Rohit on a data-driven retro framework for grant managers before Ben wraps us up for the day. And so last thing I just want to say before we break is just, reminding kind of why we did this in the first place and some of the goals that we were hoping to accomplish. We really want there to be takeaways for grant operators and grantees, that we realize a number of the panels might be a little more in the direction of operators, but we really hope that everyone can walk away with a sense of current trends and challenges, as well as touching on, some regional specifics, the buzzwords of AI and kind of what's actually happening there, and excited to hear the fireside with David today in that direction as well. And so, yeah, just last call to action before I pass it off will be that just please don't be shy in reaching out. Again, the whole point of this is to really kickstart and continue growing a larger community effort around Web3 grant programs. And we really want to bridge this to beyond Web3 and connect it with Web2 grant programs as well. So we're really excited to have Aria, to have Ken from Mercy Corps today, and other groups who are kind of thinking or existing at this intersection. So with that, I think we are ready for our first speaker of the day. And I will wait for Mike to join us in a brief moment. And I know Feems is going to be emceeing the morning, so I'm going to hand it off to Feems for the MC duties to intro the first presentation from Mike. So yeah, thanks everyone, and I will speak to y'all later.
Hey, Feems, if you're... Are people able to hear me?
We'll be creating and using.
There we go. Feems, we couldn't hear you. I think we can hear you now, though.
Okay. Go ahead, Mike. Go ahead.
Are you sure? Okay. All right. Good morning, everybody. Really quick, I can't tell if am I presenting this or is somebody else? I think I am. Okay, great. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining. I don't know if I hope everybody was here yesterday, because I came away yesterday with a lot of notes and messages from people last night, and so I was really interesting to see the amount of collaboration that just happened from yesterday, and hope to see that going forward. Today, I wanted to talk about evidence-driven decision-making. This is something that the Grant Innovation Lab at MetaGov has been focusing more on, with, the improvement of standards and improving the use of standards within Web3 grant making. And so today, what I wanted to talk about was some of those standards, where we're at, where we hope to go, and what we're doing now to help us get there. But I want to make sure that everybody realizes that the emphasis of what I want to talk about today is decision making, and the simple question of, are we making the right decisions, and are we making those decisions in the right way? Do we have the evidence to inform those decisions? And do we know what kind of evidence we need for those decisions? So given that brief introduction from myself, I'm a contributor to the Grant Innovation Lab at MetaGov. My background is primarily in the international development space. I was a social scientist and researcher with various, multilateral donors like the World Bank and UN agencies. I worked with the US State Department for a while, worked with Millennium Challenge for a while. My last job was with USAID before it dissolved. When I was with those entities, I did some work with Web3 in terms of researching some of the initial applications of how we were using Web3 for different type of social impacts, everything from land titling to DeFi. And so, I think one of my personal hopes is that I'm able to take some of this experience as a social scientist working with rigorous research methodologies. But I think the thing I want to really emphasize is that as we start to integrate more and more rigorous research into Web3 grant making, it really is about finding best fit approaches, right? Because our focus is on optimizing our decision making, we want to apply as rigorous of standards and methods as we can, but we also realize that this is a new space that we're moving into, and so we need to have some level of flexibility to account for the level of innovation that's happening in this space and keep pace with that. But I think one of the big messages we want to get across today is that, experimentation without evidence informing that experimentation has a high probability of opportunity cost. And so that's one thing that we want to mitigate. And so that's a little bit about me. I'm credible because my headshot was taken in front of a bookshelf, right? So I'm a reader and I'm a smart guy. And so you should listen to me because that's what I'm trying to convey there. So key takeaways of what we want to talk about today. The pyramid on the right, I'm not sure if people have seen this pyramid before, but it's called the wisdom pyramid. It's like the kitchen's pyramid. It's got all kinds of different names, but essentially it summarizes the process of taking all this raw data that you have in whatever your space is. For us, it's Web3 grant making space. We've already got a ton of data, and we've talked a little bit about that. But the question is, are we transforming that data into information, that information into knowledge, that knowledge into wisdom, where wisdom is our objective, right? Wisdom is where we've optimized our decision making because we have curated our data into excellent knowledge and evidence that we can use to inform that decision making. And so each kind of tier in that pyramid is a value add, right? And so the question is how do we operationalize this pyramid in the Web3 space, in the Web3 grant making space? And what does that curation process look like to where we're getting that value add at all those different levels? I think that we're doing some of this piecemeal and ad hocly within Web3 grant making, but it needs to become a little bit more systematic to really capitalize on the opportunities and the potential we have with Web3 grant making. So some of the key takeaways that that I hope that you get from today's conversation is that, right now, despite all of our aspirations, Web3 grant making is highly centralized and unaccountable. There's not a lot of transparency in how decisions are made, and those decisions extend everything from what needs exist within the ecosystem, how those needs are correlated to grant making, and the decision making behind what grants are funded. And in terms of wisdom, my simple definition, I saw the question just now. In terms of wisdom, the simple definition I'm using is optimized decision making. And what I mean by that is it's informed by evidence, right? It's not piecemeal or ad hoc or gut feeling, so to speak. But there's a lot behind that we can unpack. But for today's purposes, we're going to go with that definition. Another key takeaway that I want you to get from today is that, again, there's very low barriers to experimentation within Web3 grant making, right? Code is cheap. It's easy to produce. You can create new mechanisms, new data structures, whatever, or standards, whatever it is you want. But the question is, what is the end of that experimentation in terms of overall ecosystem objectives, sustainabilities, and return on the values that we want to see? And again, given the fact that we don't have these processes in place, there's a lot of inefficiencies and wasted resources. The lack of accountability and level of centralization is resulting in less trust in those grant-making authorities and an overall higher risk. And so what our purpose is in talking about this today and some of the work that we're doing in the Grant Innovation Lab is we want to transform all this kind of fragmented strategy that we see in the current Web3 grant making landscape and transform it into cumulative learning, right? Where we learn how to do the right things, which we're defining as how do we align our funding, our grant making funding with our ecosystem objectives, where we have this nice, line of causation, our hypothesis for how grant making directly contributes to our ecosystem objectives. And are we doing those things in the right way? Meaning, are we applying evidence and are we applying the best fit standards? So the current state of play that we see. And this is from research that the Grant Innovation Lab has done previously and some of the research that we've done currently, which we're going to talk about in a couple of slides. But overall, we're finding that there's just a strong desire for more outcome-related data and less desire for more of the vanity metrics, right? So vanity metrics are, the ones that are very, very easy to collect. And so therefore, they become those metrics that you collect the most of, right? We call this metric drift, where you're collecting a lot of output data. We hosted all these hackathons. We trained all these developers. We have this many pull requests. We had this many completed tasks. And that's the primary of metrics that we're going off of. We don't have a lot of outcome data, but there's a lot of demand for outcome data. We have poor definitions of ecosystem objectives and planning. There's an emphasis on standards, and those standards are primarily in this realm of data standards, mechanisms, and knowledge objects. And this reflects a lot of the work being done by the Mechanism Library or the Mechanism Institute and their Mechanism Library, DAOstar, and the Koi Pond. And so we do see this emerging capacity for creating and implementing standards, but we just don't have performance standards. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But overall, there's an over-reliance on informal networks and anecdotal data to get a sense of the performance of Web3 grant making, right? We don't have good empirical data that we can really make solid decisions on yet, but we're getting there. So this is the vision, right, for what the future state of play is. And we're going to talk about, how some of the work we're currently doing is contributing to this, but there's still a lot more to do. So when we look at the, this kind of graphic or this visual on the right, it kind of gives this process for how we transform our data into wisdom, right? And harking back to that pyramid that we saw, where number one is we have all of this raw data from Web3 grant programs. What we need to do is start to integrate standards into those data, what's reported, how it's reported, how it's collected, etc., so that when we go into our data collection and we create our data lakes, it becomes repositories that can be easily curated and searched, not just for researchers, but for funders, for grantees to go find out what works and why. And that goes into that evidence synthesis and analysis, right? And that evidence synthesis and analysis can be for and that can be done by anybody from independent evaluators that are looking to inform policy on grant programs as a whole, as well as individual grantees to figure out what should my grant look like when I'm going to apply. Again, this is the vision, and I want to talk a little bit about now. We're working on an individual project called the Grant Impact Handbook that contributes to part of this vision. And apologies, I know I'm kind of moving quickly, but that's just how it goes. So the Grant Impact Handbook, we've been working on this for a few months now. We've got a few months to go, 2 or 3 months to go. And while the Grant Impact Handbook covers a lot of different things, there's a lot of different research questions that it's covering, but some of the primary research questions have to do with how do we know the contribution of individual grants to ecosystem objectives. And so part of what the Grant Impact Handbook is doing is creating a step-by-step guide to help us answer that question. But in order to answer that question, we have to conduct some ecosystem planning, right? Where we're actually articulating our objectives for the ecosystem, coming up with causal pathways for how those objectives line up with our grant program objectives. It also includes impact measurement frameworks that informs adaptive learning for the ecosystem. So, as we're collecting data from our grant programs, how do we use that data to state the contribution to ecosystem objectives, but also inform adaptive changes that we need to either change to our ecosystem objectives, our grant programs, etc. And so it embeds this continuous learning into that grant making process. And it just makes everybody a little bit more accountable. And we really wanted this to be actionable. And so we didn't want it just to be a descriptive analysis of what's happening. And so we broke each kind of, the entire handbook's broken down into phases and steps, and included in those steps are tools and templates and toolkits to help users actually implement them. Because, the hope is that we create this handbook, we put it out, and it becomes easier for everybody to use, from grantees to grantors. It's nice for grantees to have it because then they know what the expectations are for, what they're going to be held accountable to. The handbook is broken down into separate phases, from ecosystem planning to grant program design and funding, monitoring of grant performance, and then contribution assessment. And this is where you have data back from your grant programs and you want to answer questions about, what was the exact contribution of this grant or this cluster of grants to the overall ecosystem objectives. This does that. But I think another kind of side effect of this type of process, not just the contribution assessment itself, but all of these phases, is that they're meant to be collaborative with different stakeholders, both within the ecosystem, the primary stakeholders within the ecosystem, as well as potential grantees coming into the ecosystem. So when we talk about the lack of trust and due to lack of transparency and accountability that's happened up until now, the hope is that this not only supplies empirical evidence for what works and why, but also it does it in a way that it creates stakeholdership, and it mitigates a lot of that lack of trust and performance that we've seen so far. So in terms of future directions, what we want to do is, really build out the performance and impact measurement standards for Web3 grant making. And what this can include is, guidance and decision trees and tools for picking the best grant program design, which essentially comes down to mechanism testing, right? I alluded to the work that the Mechanism Institute is doing in building out their mechanism library, where we're going to have a whole host of different mechanisms we can choose for funding. But the question is, well, which one's optimal for the problems we're having? And so, the hope is that moving forward, we start to create standards and toolkits to answer those questions. And this also goes into the type of grants as well, that ties into all this public goods discussions that people are having, where, a lot of things were lumped into that public goods category. We need to get more specialized now. How do we identify the best type of grantees for these different types of grants? Who has the most likelihood of success? We should develop criteria and standards for that as well. And again, one of the big things that we're doing is building out our metric libraries, right? What are the metrics we're using? What outcomes and outputs are they measuring? How well are they doing? And if we kind of create a menu for users and say, like, here's all the metrics you can choose from, here's guidance on how to best select your metrics, how best to select your outcomes that they measure, any modification that you have to do to customize it for your ecosystem, here are some things to think about in doing that. So these are future directions that we'd like to head into, as well as, how do we integrate AI into this, and how does this all go towards sustainable portfolios where we have a good balance of long-term growth, where innovation and experimentation, and it all represents the values that we want for that ecosystem, where return on investment isn't just economic, right? It should be partly economic in terms of, are we getting, financial returns for the ecosystem in regards to the investment, but also what's the contribution of that investment on the values, that the reason why we set up this ecosystem in the first place. So I will stop there for questions. Thank you.
So you have actually one question. Can you share a bit from your experience in terms of how much work evaluation takes and how much it usually costs as a percentage of a total?
I think there's standards out there, and I think it depends on what we call like, evaluation. If we're just talking about internal monitoring and for internal decision making and adaptive management, you know, very roughly, I would say around 10% is just kind of like this old wise. It just seems like whatever space I find myself in, whether it's working with the UN or working with Gates or some other foundation, that number just kind of floats out there, right? So I would say that that's kind of like a rough estimate. Now, if we're talking about bringing in third-party evaluators to do, special ad hoc work on priority learning requirements, then that's a different discussion. But 10% of budget, because I mean, I think that, and that sounds like a lot, right? But I think that there is such good evidence out there about investing that 10% in good decision making. The returns on that good decision making usually outstrip the 10%, right? And so, yeah.
And then the final question, which I'll actually rephrase, can you tell us about maybe the launch of the Impact Handbook and how it's actually being built? Is it internal with MetaGov?
I mean, right now it is somewhat internal, and in terms of how it's being built, I mean, you can ask everybody who's reviewed it, but I would say slowly. And I think the reason I say slowly is because there's such an emphasis on making it actionable to where it's like we're literally going through like step 1, step 2. If you don't need to do this step, skip to this step. And so it's finding that right balance between rigor and usability. And I should also say that this is going to be whatever's pushed out into the public here in the next 2-3 months. It's going to be V1. In my mind, what I'd like to optimally do is push out a draft to the public, have some kind of public discussion on it with all kinds of stakeholders, grantors, grantees. Everybody's going to use it, and the feedback is this is what we like, this is what's unfeasible, etc. And then the first kind of official version is released. But then every once in a while, it needs to be updated, right? This is a fast-moving space, and so I think if there's not, a mechanism in place to update it, then it's going to become outdated fairly quickly. So Zach asked, also curious what new innovations are being incorporated into that.
Final question.
Oh, go ahead, Veeam. Sorry. I think we got a delay. Feems, I apologize. I'm just going to keep talking, and I think we're at time, so I'm going to answer Zach's question.
Got
it. Yeah, sorry, Feems. Zach asks, also curious what new innovations are being incorporated into the handbook regarding impact attestation, since the focus here is on attribution. So, excellent question. I wouldn't say that right here we're talking so much about attribution, because attribution tends to be more of a statistical term, which means that if you're saying that, you can attribute this change in your ecosystem to this grant, you actually statistically modeled it and you found a statistically significant result, right? I think here we're talking more about contribution, but I think that your question about impact attestations is actually really, really important, because especially as we start to use oracles who are attesting a certain type of outcome, the question is, what kind of criteria and standards do we have on those oracles to mitigate the risk we have on that outcome actually being materialized, if actually there, so we don't get like a type 2 error, type 1 or 2 error. So that's it. Everybody, please feel free to reach out to me at any time. Yeah, and we'll leave it at that. And we'll, excellent. So I guess we are ready for the next presentation. If Eugene,
yeah, I'll jump in. Unfortunately, Feems is having some lag, so I'll just jump in to MC for now. So thank you so much for that, and appreciate you kicking off the day. Next up, we are going to have a panel focused on grantee success looking at some various looking at some various elements of collaboration, acceleration, and measuring impact. So Sam from DAOstar is going to be the host of the panel, and the conversation will be with Isla, Kacie, and Kitty, and everyone will have a chance to introduce themselves. So yeah, I will pass it off to Sam to host the conversation.
Thank you, Eugene, and hey everyone. I hope everyone's doing great. For the sake of time, I say let's just hop right into it. I was thinking that we just start with some intros from each of you, and maybe to get to the core themes of the summit. Maybe also just addressing how your work currently includes this focus on sustainable funding and growth. So Isla, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, cool. Hey, everyone. I'm Isla, working since 10 years, first in venture capital and then in the grants ecosystem, and now building Switzerland, which is a permanent Zuzulu hub in Switzerland. And our focus is on accelerating frontier tech and DIAC, and doing so in a way with a focus on open source and creating an investable model for that to be financially sustainable.
Go ahead, Kacie.
Yeah, so can you hear me?
Yep, all good.
Awesome. So my name is Kacie, lifelong builder. I've been building public goods for nearly a decade now. Currently, I work at the Ethereum Foundation as a strategic funding coordinator, and my role is actually very directly tied to the sustainable funding of Ethereum. So the SFC team is typically the team that supports mature projects in the ecosystem and with co-funding, and is the team that is most concerned about the long-term sustainable funding of the Ethereum ecosystem. And in terms of outcomes and impacts, our focus is also making sure that funding isn't just about supporting projects in the moment, but making sure that we're able to track what moves the needle.
Great, thank you. And lastly, Kitty.
Hi, is my sound okay?
Yeah, hear you loud
Okay,
and clear.
great. Awesome. Yes, so I've been managing grants programs for the past few years in a professional capacity. So I run an accelerator program, an incubator program, and also work closely with a team on a hackathon program for Open Campus for Eugene. Personally, I have a lot of friends who are artists who are always asking about how to get grants. So that spans quite a big range of grant sizes and levels of impact.
Fantastic. So yeah, thank you for your intros. The way I was thinking of this panel going, I've got some targeted questions for each of you, but I'd like it to remain more of a conversation. So please, if anybody has a follow-up thought on one of the other panelists, what they're saying, please feel free to add after they're done. But Isla, I was thinking of starting with you and kind of this topic of how you're approaching the problem of improving the investability and sustainability of funding ecosystems, and what roles can different models such as accelerators, as well as different mechanisms like convertible grants play in the future of Web3 funding?
Yeah, sure. So as I said, I started my career in venture capital, which was excellent, but quickly realized this is how we're deciding what the future of society looks like. And it's very effective at funding one kind of thing, but less effective at other models, and became very passionate about finding more flexible methods of funding different things, and then came into Web3 about 5 years ago, and also was a little shocked observing the Web3 ecosystem, seeing yes, we have this grants funding, but that's also at times very inflexible, very specific to open source and public goods, and less flexible towards other models. And also just kind of what was a bit concerning for me was sort of the financial sustainability aspect, and it was concerning that there's no way of actually seeing the upside from these projects. Many of the projects that are getting grants funding are actually ending up getting venture funding at a later point in time. And how can we actually ensure that they don't just go around grants farming, moving between ecosystems, and the ecosystem doesn't actually benefit from that at all. And so with Switzerland, and I've been now involved with Zuzulu for a couple of years and been at multiple pop-up villages. And one of the cool and exciting things, there's many about these pop-up villages, but one specifically that I observed is that they make excellent kind of short-term due diligence hubs. The fact that you're in this concentrated tight social graph for an extended amount of time is a very interesting way of actually building understanding of the people, the builders, their intentions and goals, also their skills, not just their technical skills, but also their emotional intelligence, how well they might be able to collaborate or lead. And it gives you a lot more data points in terms of how strong is this potential grantee or investee. And so what we've started thinking about with Switzerland is that these permanent hubs that are supporting DIAC and supporting open source can actually be kind of like a defensive social layer for Ethereum and for DIAC and for all of these good things that we want to fund, where we have a tight social graph, and it's not just capital and allocating capital that gives legitimacy, but also legitimacy coming from the social graph and from the experience in person and the reputation and contributions that person's making it in person. And so we're looking at building an accelerator with Switzerland, and hopefully that is successful and becomes a template for others, where we invest specifically with a focus on open source, but it's done with a convertible grant, so that doesn't need to be paid back unless they end up commercializing. And then if they do commercialize, that converts either into equity or tokens or whatever. And we're trying to design it in a way that it's quite flexible, so that it's reasonably builder friendly, and it's not, if they're doing something that's slightly out of the normal, that it's able to adjust to that scenario. And I think what's nice about this too is that it would go into kind of an endowment fund, these tokens, and that then the incentives of the local community are aligned to the builders, and that there's an incentive of people in that local community to help each other and actually make those grants a success as much as possible. Yeah, I'll stop there. Quite a long answer already.
No, that was great. Yeah, I'm wondering, Kitty, if you have like a follow-up to that, considering your experience like in the accelerator world as well. Isla speaking a lot about like the social graph and the social support that builders receive. Is that something that you have also experienced? And like, if you have anything to add on to that?
Yes, I was nodding vigorously when you mentioned that. I really love you mentioned the idea of a due diligence process, but it's actually a much more human way to assess how builders would respond to certain situations or certain connections or certain relationships. Because at the end of the day, that sort of resilience, that mindset is what makes people build for the long term and contribute value and be flexible, even though circumstances might change, macro might change. But it really helps you assess, I guess, the character of the grant recipient, and yeah, it's a really good proxy for that.
Yeah, Kacie, I guess I'll let you go as well, because I know one of the things you're working on right now is like looking at ways to improve the grant experience for grantees and builders. So is that kind of how you're thinking about the that challenge, or like if you have additional thoughts to add as well?
Yeah, some additional thoughts is I really like the convertibility aspect of your name is, sorry, Isla?
Isla.
Sorry, Isla, I apologize. I really like the convertibility aspect of what Isla mentioned, because I have been talking to teams or grant allocators that have been leaning too heavily into this accelerator programs, and really forgetting that if you're a pure public good, you typically can't, generate revenue, right? So I really like the fact that there's like a convertible aspect to it. If you go on and if you receive venture capital funding, then there's something that happens there. So I think that's a really smart approach, and I think more grant allocators will probably start to do that.
Great. I guess continuing with this theme on like almost the social layer for grants and grantees, Kacie, one of the things I know you're thinking about as well is fostering collaboration among grant operators, and how this impacts the experience for grantees themselves. So, I would love to hear some of your ideas on how you plan to foster this collaboration and some of the potential impact that can have on the builder experience.
Yeah, so this is a personal opinion. I want to talk a bit more about what we're doing at FSFC, potentially a bit later in the panel. But my own personal opinion is that I believe that grant operators should work together more for the sake of builder experience, because it would make builder experience better. And the reason I believe that is because grant operators collaborating would open up more interesting research questions and help fight builder fragmentation. And I want you to think about, everyone listening, what it's like to be a grant allocator of Web3 in 2025. You've got your RFPs that your company probably created internally to fit its own strategy, because that's where we're headed. Use some metrics to measure grant impact, and you're probably competing with a bunch of layer ones and layer twos for attention and market share. So you end up playing this game of, how can we best fragment the total pool of builders to incentivize the best ones to build on my protocol using our programming language, to build solutions that we perceive as valuable to give us competitive advantage over our competitors. And that's a fine thing to do, but I think it's not the best approach for builders, for the sake of the builder experience. And I believe that if we want to grow the pie and bring, good new talent into the ecosystem and not just shovel people around, we need to think in big pictures. And it's hard to do that in the sort of hyper-competitive ecosystem that I described. And builders feel that, right? Because many builders came in, and for reference, for people listening, I mentioned I'm a lifelong builder. I've received grants to build on Arbitrum, Uniswap, Optimism, Celo, Fuel, right? So I'm really in tune with the builder experience. And builders really, I feel like, came into Web3 to build the future, but ended up being as, pseudo contractors for various chains, right? So I believe that to improve, and this is my own personal opinion, but to improve the broader builder landscape, grant allocators should be working together and reacting to real world problems, right? For example, there was a really big debacle about, YouTube and Spotify just like maybe a month ago, because they now require IDs to use their platforms, which is a perfect ZK use case. And in response to that, we have, I think, 3 different teams from 3 different chains trying to make a solution, which is fine. But imagine if there was like more collaboration between the ZK grant operators and they co-funded and framed it as an open question. I think it would just be more exciting for builders, and it would result in better solutions. And I think that's where we're headed. And just yesterday, actually, I didn't plan this, but Justin Drake on a podcast from the Ethereum Foundation proposed like a $1 million bounty on a ZK conjecture. And I imagine other ZK operators want to fund that. So in my personal opinion, I think we're headed to a more collaborative environment for operators. And I think operators that adapt to that and build a collaborative network will succeed in that sort of collaborative future that I just described, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. A quick follow-up before getting Isla and Kitty's opinion on that. Are there ways within the Ethereum ecosystem that you're looking, like new ways to foster that collaboration? I mean, it's all good to just say we want to collaborate, that it'll be one happy family, but there are competitive pressures in this industry that can be pretty strong. So I'm just wondering how you're going about thinking about that problem.
Definitely. It is a problem, as you mentioned, because Ethereum Foundation, and I'm speaking for myself, in my own personal opinion, can't just, post a list of initiatives that they think is worthwhile, then everyone funds those things, because that's not very decentralized, right? If everyone's sort of on that same page there, people should grant teams should come up with their own criteria for what they think is good to fund. But something that sort of has been happening in the background is there's been a big effort on the foundation side of layer 2 coordination, right? Sort of cross-pollinating, saying, hey, you guys are working on this, you guys are working on this, right? Like not saying you should work together, but you guys are trying to solve the same problem here, right? Maybe do some co-funding, right? So that is, it's a difficult problem to solve, right? This is more of in my own personal opinion, and it's more something that's more experimental. So I don't know exactly how this will look like in the next 2, 3, 4 years, but I think we're headed to a more collaborative environment based on layer 2 coordination, based on these open questions that are starting to come up with different funders co-funding open research questions.
Yeah, Isla or Kitty, I see you nodding. Is there something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, co-funding is quite underrated. And I think it's something that takes courage to be the first person to ask. It seems like people are always circling each other, but you just never know. So I've had people approach me and ask, oh, do you guys do co-funding? Do you co-invest? And I've never said no. So I don't know why people don't start that conversation more. I'm curious to know why, what the blocker might be. Is it just fear of looking silly, or is it something more structural?
I'm also seconding the need for more co-funding, and I'm surprised at how little of it I've seen in the Web3 space. I definitely also wonder, like, why can't we collaborate more? I mean, I know that we all have our politics, but I'm not sure.
Sorry if I can just jump in. I think it's because, again, it's a very hyper competitive landscape, right? Like if I'm a ZK allocator, I'm competing with the other roll up, right? And I'm trying to basically, for lack of a better word, I'm trying to like not run them out of business, but I'm trying to be successful against them, right? And that's again all fine and dandy, but I think there's going to be more room for co-funding in the future, right? I think we're starting to see it now, and I think it's going to grow the pie a lot more, because if I'm a builder, right, if I hop into Web3 and I'm like, oh, there's a really interesting research question, right? And I don't have to learn the specific tech stack, right? It's more about these guys are coming together and I'm trying to solve this more idealistic problem. It's just more attractive to people that would potentially enter the space. So yeah, it's because of competition, and I think teams aren't seeing the benefits of co-funding as much as they really should be. But I think the first ones to do so will be the ones that benefit the most.
So with the last few minutes, I wanted to pose a question to Kitty. Really honing in on the grantee and like builder experience, which I know that you do a lot of time thinking about. So I'm wondering, like, what common practices around grantee support, and specifically around the topic of like accountability, have you observed that aren't working? And how do you think that we should go about improving them?
Yeah, so the lens with which we approach this is actually a little different. So we actually see the grant experience as a learning experience, which just begins with a 6-week or 12-week accelerator or incubator. And I actually believe the meat of the learning experience happens when they actually take on the grant and actually start building. So the incubation or the acceleration is just like a entree, but the actual substance where the rubber really hits the road is that. So, and I think the framework that people tend to adopt is compliance, which is not something that really gels well with humans. Like when you have people asking for reports or how you're tracking on performance, are you delivering what you promised? It would make me immediately defensive. So when the way we've designed the reporting experience, for example, we don't call it reporting, we call it check-ins. When we still have the information that we need to collect every month, we want to know if they're hitting the KPIs, but just the way you phrase the questions could be much more human-centered and invites people to lean in and collaborate and share what's blocking them. So for example, instead of saying, have you hit your KPIs you promised for this month, we'd say share a win, or share something you're struggling with. So really human. It's a lot more inclusive, because also not every grant recipient is from a developed country. We try to make it as friendly to non-English speakers as possible. And it still gives us the information we need. Often we get much more in-depth information that helps us solve the root of a problem or identify an opportunity that's quite left field. So we think of them as people we're learning alongside with. And that also gives us a good foundation for when we do need to hold them accountable, if a few things have been missed, if expectations are misaligned, that the depth of that relationship allows us to hold people accountable in a way that they actually appreciate and respect. I'll pause there in case anyone would like to latch onto anything.
Isla, you're applauding, so I'm wondering what your follow-up thoughts are there.
Yeah, I think that's a really great model, and I really applaud that. I think it's super important to think about this kind of the grantees as I guess some people hate the term human capital, but it's important, like the capital part. Like there's something you're investing in and you want to build up over time, and it's not always going to be a one-shot win. And like I'm an economist, so I come at it like repeated games. Like if you're thinking about the long term and investing in people for the long term, there was like a term that came up during Switzerland of like human composting. So they might fail at the first thing, but if you understand why and they can learn from that and build on that, then that can be a win. Like those are then the veterans that maybe win the second time, and I really love that. So awesome.
Kacie, did you have last thoughts as well before I turn it over to audience Q&A?
Actually, no, it took the words right out of my mouth. I do think basically a +1. Not worth repeating.
Look at us collaborating as a panel right now. It's wonderful. Well, anyway, we do have one question, or actually maybe two now, both from Zach. But looking at his first question in the chat, this one was directed to Isla, but it can be to the panel as well. What examples have you seen with other early stage funders, for example, angel investors, seed stage VCs, who have put traditional equity on top of your convertible grants? How have these instruments been received by the follow-on capital stack?
We're very early in the phase of speaking to investors about this model, so I can't speak heavily. I haven't seen it done yet at all or much. So hopefully others can report more.
Well, yeah, the second question actually, it has to do with the first, and maybe you can speak more generally to if you've seen, and if you're just, yeah, it's too new, then that's okay as well. But if there's been any kind of other types of funding mechanisms that have been added on top of or alongside the convertible grant mechanisms, like if you can speak more generally to that, or if there's plans in that direction as well.
Sure. So what we were trying to do is develop an investable model and create something that works for equity investors that care about returns and care about the long-term impact. And one inspiration that we've been taking is looking at things like Harvard and Stanford that have created long-term campuses. It's a physical environment where people are learning from each other, and there's like a lot of investment being put into fellowships and research, but there's also an endowment fund that's making investments and has to make a return and sustain itself and ideally grow. And from that endowment fund, you've got a percentage every year that goes into those public goods and things. So we're taking that as an inspiration. Another thing we've looked at as inspiration is like the Swiss National Bank, which so we're based in Switzerland, and the Swiss National Bank is actually a publicly listed company, and it has its goals as a national bank, but it also is something that any investor can come and buy a share in. And we're taking that as a little bit of inspiration for how do we bring capital into things that we care about and have investments into this ecosystem, but then also be able to do the things that actually matter to the specific ecosystem. So we're thinking about it as like the Switzerland National Bank. How do we bring those investors in? And that's the challenge there.
Kitty, Kacie, any last thoughts on that?
No thoughts. She said it all.
Yeah, perfect. Well, I mean, we do have one more question from the chat, and like a couple minutes left. So, what does a grantee life cycle? This one's from Themes. What does a grantee life cycle out of grants look like? How do we reduce grantee dependency? Maybe through other support services or mechanisms. And this can be for anyone who has thoughts on this.
Yeah. Kitty, you go first.
Yeah, so something we've been trying out with some of our grant recipients is just supporting them very intensely on fundraising. And by fundraising, we don't just mean VCs. That could also include just getting a bank loan. Because if you are able to get credit, that means you have to have a certain level of business activity, revenue, and cash flow. And we actually think getting access to credit is a great signal of the sustainability of a business. It doesn't have to be huge, but just they have enough to sustain a certain size or a certain level of impact. So it's not sexy. People don't really like talking about debt, but it's sensible and a bit more conservative. So that's just something we've been experimenting with.
Plus one to that, on my end, comments on sort of the grantee life cycle. As Kitty used the word intent, not sure if it was collaboration, but really just talking to these grantees, right? Figuring out what they need, because we found, like, for example, at the SFC, we've talked to grantees that need additional foundation support, right? And we've been able to help there, right? We've talked to grantees and actually figured out that, hey, we'll refer you to a public innovation agency in the UK or Singapore or the EU/EEA, and it's worked out wonderfully over there, right? And then we've talked to grantees that we've referred to over to Founder Success because their product that they've made is turned into more of a private good, right? So the answer is it depends. It depends on the grantee. It depends on the project. It depends on what they need, and the art is kind of figuring that out. And sometimes grantees also need like non-financial support, right? So it depends on the grantee. If you're able to figure that out, that's sort of the game you need to play, and the best solution just depends on who you're talking to.
Could I quickly chime in on that?
Please do.
I think so that's really important to sit down with the grantee and have an honest conversation about the size of the business they want to build. So not everyone wants to build a VC funded business, and Isla mentioned at the start, like, that is a model that doesn't work for everyone. So some of them might be happy to be a solopreneur for the rest of their life. Some of them might want to build a giant business with a giant exit, but there's everything in between. And that will decide on the funding strategy and what sort of instruments we design or recommend to them.
Great. Well, with that, we are right on time. So I just wanted to say thank you to our panel, Isla, Kitty, and Kacie. That was a super interesting conversation, and thank you all for your time today.
Thank
you.
I guess we're going to invite Feems back up to MC the next item on the program.
Yep, so that was a great discussion. Thank you for that, Sam. Next would be Rashmi, who would be leading a fireside chat with David DAO on scaling democratic participation. Take it away, Rashmi.
Thank you, Feems. Hi, everyone. I'm Rashmi from MetaGov, and I'm thrilled to have David here for a fireside chat. David is a co-founder and chief scientist of Rainforest, and his work has been recognized by many reputable organizations. And so he is pioneering experiments in AI. And today we'll be diving into that with the questions going through the approach, the tech of it, and outcomes, and also the dilemmas. So thank you, David. Thank you for joining us. And I would love for you to give us a brief about DeepGov and Simocracy, and then share how it works and why AI at all.
Yeah, so thanks for the invitation. To maybe give a bit of background, as Rashmi already said, I'm the co-founder and chief scientist of Gainforce.earth, which doesn't have a lot to do with designing mechanisms for once. We are a nature conservation organization that distributes funds to communities around the world. And we participated in the X-Prize Rainforest a couple of years ago, where we wanted to really understand the local community's needs and purposes so we can distribute the funds properly, but also such that the funds that they receive are well managed, right? And so we didn't find a way to really capture the local communities. Like, you have to think of them as indigenous communities in Brazil or the Amazon or Kenya. We work in 43 communities around the world. And we didn't have a really good way that scaled technologically to capture that democratic approach of deliberation, understanding them, and also making sure that there's a legitimate approach of managing these funds. And so we came up with a technology that uses LLMs first initially to translate language barriers, because they were speaking Portuguese, Swahili, and other languages, to basically make sense of all the comments what they are saying. But then we met with Audrey Tang, who's the first digital minister of Taiwan, and her work has really inspired us, because her work as a digital minister really put democracy at the forefront of like designing and improving, and she used technology to improve democracy. And one of her technologies was called broad listening, which is making sense of a lot of information from lots of people And she and Glenn wrote a book called Plurality that then someone else read the book, which is Takahiro Anno, who was a sci-fi author in Japan, 33 years old. And after reading the book, he decides to run for governor of Tokyo and implement some of the techniques. So you have to imagine it's super crazy. Like this book inspired someone to run for governor of Tokyo without any background in politics. And he implemented some of these algorithms to do sense-making broad listening. And in the end, historically, even though he didn't win governor, he was the fifth most voted person and the most in history from anyone who started from scratch. And now he just started a new political party in Japan that used these technologies, and he got a seat in the parliament. So that's so insane. And so I think there's a huge opportunity for technology to create more democratic participation in grants funding, in mechanism design, in public goods management. And we were really inspired by this approach from our communities, of course, to Takahiro Anno's run to really design a mechanism that challenges and brings some of these ideas into the public goods funding space, the PGF space. So we reached out to Woki and Gitcoin with a concept called DeepGov that basically takes broad listening in. So we do a lot of surveys, interviews using Polis and other technologies to understand who are the donors, who are the funders, what do they believe on, what are their values. And then we use technology to extract personas. These personas represent different kind of opinion groups. Then we create an LM politician, we call it, an AI agent that has this persona represented. You can talk to this LM agent, and this LM agent in the end scores your Gitcoin application. And so for GT23, we had a $50,000 budget where we basically got this money. We ran these agents. There was a really nice trick to it. After talking to the agent, there was a 2-week voting process where you had to vote for one of those 3 agents using quadratic voting. These 3 agents were Luna, who was super open source capitalist. Then there was Grant, who was a communist, Gitcoin communist. And there was a Panda Bear, who was representing the region space in its value systems. And in the end, it was a really, really close election period between Panda Bear and Luna. Panda Bear won. And so they all aggregated together and they distributed the funds. And so that's how we distributed funds using AI agents acting as politicians and using technology to really capture a legitimate democratic approach.
Wow, yeah, I love the inspiring origin story and all that, how it came into reality. When it comes to broad listening and also the AI approach side of things, from what I understand is right now, DeepGov models 3 ideals into AI agents. So can you please share if it's a concern that if all the AI agents end up using one model, and even with your recently published democracy work, where even people can model AI agents with their own frameworks. So how do you see the risk of this? If we end up using one model, could it become a hive brain and it becomes a unanimous decision?
Great question. So there's definitely a risk that everyone uses one technology, the centralization aspect. Definitely one of the reasons we decided not that one model distributes the fund, but 3 different kind of personas of the model distributes the fund comes from that hope that this will kind of split off the model's opinion groups. So one model is definitely a dictator, but a AI parliament might be a little bit richer. So your question is more technical. Even if we all use GPT-5, and even though we have different kind of system prompts, right, is it still kind of that one model? And the answer, so to give you a background, I did my PhD in AI research. So the background here is yes and no. In many sense, that one model, because it's a foundation model, it's trained on the whole internet. So that model itself is plural and diverse with a parenthesis, because it of course is biased towards where most of the data is, which is English-speaking data. But system prompts that basically emphasizes role play, and you say you should represent this perspective, you should represent this perspective, is very, very strong. We call it context learning, to unleash and focuses this big models opinion groups into that group that we care about. There are much more stronger ways to trim the model. Fine-tuning is another one, but there are ways basically to make this model less of a hive mind, because it captured already so many of the plural opinions of humanity, given aside the data bias, right? And so I definitely can see the concern, but I think with current methods and also with really, really nice prompt tuning, and of course, having the human always kind of in the decision loop itself, reviewing it, this is something that we can avoid and we can work with.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. I would like to also ask, how does broad listening work? Is it more than just reading through forums and putting it into LLMs, or are there any, like, to clarify the question, what are the channels that broad listening uses?
Broad listening is such a beautiful technology. It's very simple, so simple that even a political party understands it. So we happen to use broad listening also for the Liberal Party of Germany that just got kicked out by the parliament. And so the general secretary, she actually reached out because she saw the work of broad listening, not so much DeepGov, because that is a little bit too much for a party, but like broad listening itself, she saw a lot of benefits for using it, for example, to make sense of her party members' opinions to restructure the party. So broad listening, at its core, what it does, you start with a member survey. So the Liberal Party of Germany, for example, asked its members, 60,000 members, 2,000 replied with a comment on what's on your mind right now. Then everyone writes a text or speaks or sends an email, and you get like 2,000 messages, right? And what you do is now you process it through a pipeline of LLMs. The first LLM goes through all the messages and extracts, given your prompt, a topic tree and a subtopic tree. So for example, when you care about what should a better Germany look like, you go through it, all the reviews, and say, okay, future of the healthcare system, future of education, and future of that, and then you create like topics based on what you read. Then the second pass passes through each of these comments and basically extracts claims. So one, for example, says a better healthcare system requires that it's free. A better healthcare system requires that it's just for everyone, right? And you underline by quotes, and the LLM reads this text and collects all these claims. A third process then looks which claims are the most similar, right? So you can structure them in groups and opinion groups. And then the fourth basically visualizes this in a really, really beautiful way. So we have broadlistening.org, for example, that you can check out. And we did one experiment with Near Foundation, where they wanted to use broad listening technology to make sense of one of their governance threats. So you should check that out. There's an example in broadlistening.org. If you scroll down, you can click on the Near thread, and then you can see how this makes sense. And it's a really powerful tool to quickly kind of make sense of many, many opinions. Because before broad listening, we had the problem of information explosion, where we basically were flooded by information. We had no time to read through everything. And that's what broad listening solves. Also, fun fact, broad listening comes from being the opposite of broadcasting, where one person talks to many. Broad listening is many people, and then you listen to many people.
Yeah, that is really cool. So for me, I was thinking, when AI agents evaluate after broad listening, after thinking like what to judge on, I'm curious if there's been any experiment or like research done on how AI agents evaluate an AI written proposals versus an human written proposal.
Lots of. Yes, it's a whole field. Actually, it's one of the most interesting parts, because researchers, peer review is that one method that has held society and science together for centuries. One might argue, and one might hate peer reviews and committees and evaluations, but it has done its purpose. But it's broken, because as more and more submissions come in, it's more difficult to peer review, to manage everything, right? So people naturally looked into these LLMs to judge, not only in Web3, but also in AI and in academia even. And so people study this field, which is scientifically called LLM as a judge, to understand how good an LLM judges compared to a human evaluator. And it's super interesting because in many ways, LLM judges oftentimes perform better than a human evaluator because a human evaluator has a lot of noise. And sometimes if you ask them to judge the same proposal 2 weeks later, they judge a little bit slightly different. An LLM with the same seats will not, right? But on the other hand, an LLM also replicates the biases of a human. So there is some certain kind of really interesting interplay. LLMs, for example, that we use right now, they are fine-tuned to be very nice. So their judgments tend to be also very nice. So there are some tricks and traits of how to use the right model, for example, not the fine-tuned instruction model, but the base model to make these scores better. People have been arguing maybe it makes sense to not have direct scoring because it's even hard for a human to give a score, but like have direct pairwise comparisons that an LLM can do. So there's a lot of exciting stuff happening. But a small example that we can give with Simocracy, which is DeepGov 2.0, we actually had 5 people we took interviews from, and then we created a digital twin of them, and we trained it from the interview, but not from the last set of questions that we asked them. And then after they had these models, we asked the model and them the same set of questions without the model knowing. And the average accuracy was 75% accurate from a question with 3 choices each question. So it's decent. One person had accuracy of 94%, another person in the lower end had accuracy of 54%. Random would be 33%, right? So I think there is a huge potential as these models are getting better because these models are cheap to prompt, they are tireless, they can work 24/7, they don't miss a single word. There's a lot of benefits to LLM as a judge. But as you correctly said, we need to make sure that it's also ethically and well designed.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Speaking of like AI agent models, are conflict avoidance or baked into it, or can AI agents kind of like simulate real disagreements? So I feel like conflict avoidance occurs naturally and it's just a part of decision making. And if we bake into AI models to avoid conflict or to always compromise, it just wouldn't be ideal. Could you share more on that, please?
Yes. So there's really great work from DeepMind on this. It's called deliberation, one of the most underlooked parts of any governance in DAOs. We always think voting is the ultimate thing to do. No, like most of the time when you look at real governance and real governments, there's a whole long period of deliberation, which is like people discussing, sometimes arguing very passionately, but always very professionally in what is it that we want to vote on in the first place, right? Many DAOs are completely skipping this process and just throw on a vote. So deliberation kept society together, and there's really, really great work from Google DeepMind called the Habermas machine that shows that techniques such as broad listening and other like moderation techniques really help us like argue better. So there are many ways of arguing, right? There's this conflict like avoidance, which is bad, but there's also the shouting over another person, which is also bad. So the right way, the right deliberative way to basically hear everyone is to consider everyone's cultural background, expertise, and make sure that all opinions are really well. And it seems to be that LMs are performing superhuman in this aspect, citing that paper. I personally, while using these LMs, if you prompt them correctly, they can come up with really interesting conversations. When you have LMs discuss with each other, actually technique in AI safety, when you have them discuss with each other, come to much better conclusions than you have them alone, actually. So I don't see there as a conflict avoidance. I think there's a very strong debate culture within LMs, actually.
Okay, yeah, I'm glad to hear that, and thank you for sharing more details on that. We also had a question from audience from Eugene. The question is, do you see the room for improvement in the tools to help get the right puts initially? Any calls to actions that you want to throw out there?
Yeah. So I think we really need to make sure that these tools are really easy to access for everyone. right? So like, for example, you should be able to speak to it. You should be able to speak to it in a different language, in English. That's super important to include. You should get feedback really fast. So one of the things that I think deliberation always misses is you extract the opinions from your constituents, but then you don't come back with them with how this actually influenced, right? So I think in many ways, that tool should be like two-way, where you provide your opinion, but then somehow you need to know if this opinion is affected or not. Better visualizations help. We, for example, we built broadlisting.org built on top of Talk to the City. But Talk to the City had a limit of roughly 200 comments. So it couldn't scale when we worked with the Liberal Party of Germany with 2,000. So we had to build our own pipeline. So there's some engineering work that's super interesting to cache, to provide much faster and better systems to scale these LLM pipelines. And there's so much more we can do, not just extracting claims, but seeing, for example, which claims disagree with which. Can we figure out opinion groups? There's a whole field that I think, thanks to work like broad listening, Talk to the City, I think really inspired a lot of researchers to look into that seriously.
Wow, yeah. I've got a lot to catch up on all of these things, and thank you for sharing all of this knowledge with us. I hope we can also share more links if you have anything to share. Like I think we have some links up. I think we are at time now, and I'll pass over the mic.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. Well, let's wait for our next presentation. There we go. So great. We're going to keep it going with Rashmi and Sam. We're going to present on adding an intelligence layer for Web3 grants. So with that, I'll let you two take it away.
Hi.
Hey, everyone. Let me quickly share the slides here. Apologies. I'm having quick issues. If someone wants to share the slides backstage, that would be wonderful.
Oh, let me find them and I can try and share them. Share slides. Oh, you got it up. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Go ahead, Rashmi.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. I'm Rashmi, and this is Sam. We want to share with you about an intelligence layer for Web3 grants. And I'm Rashmi from DAOstar. I'm currently leading technical side of things at DAOstar, and I also on open grants. I'm a research engineer at MetaGov, and I've been in Web3 since 2021, contributing majorly in the DAO ecosystem. And to define myself, I'm a developer generalist. I'll pass over to Sam to share more.
Yeah, I'm Sam McCarthy. I'm the ecosystem growth lead for DAOstar. Just a quick line about DAOstar. We're focused on ensuring the long-term success of the DAO ecosystem through public infrastructure and supporting collaborative research. And I'm currently leading the growth and adoption of open grants, DAOstar's open source grant stack, which you'll hear a little bit more about today. So to begin with the takeaways. Here, I wanted to start off by saying that open verifiable data as a key property of our technology and value within our industry can be a huge competitive advantage, yet is something that we don't yet take full advantage of, particularly with regards to grants and capital allocation. Funding information often remains siloed, which limits efficiency, decision-making, interoperability, and collaborative learning. To address this, Rashmi and I are going to introduce the concept of an open source ecosystem-wide intelligent layer for Web3 grants, basically a way to aggregate funding information, enable tooling, reporting, and impact analyses that support better decisions, and facilitate iterative experimentation that helps grow and improve our capital allocation practices. So We all know that grant cycles are hard. I kept this first slide bare as I don't think I need to give a full rundown of grant-related challenges to an audience of operators and grantees, but I did want to highlight a few that are particularly important to this discussion. So taking an extremely high-level view of the stages of a funding cycle and their associated challenges, we first have the application stage, which often includes burdensome manual review and due diligence of potential grantees, risk management processes specifically around grant farming, and then the funding decisions themselves, particularly within a decentralized environment, pose very specific challenges. The performance monitoring as well. So this includes reporting both from a grantor and grantee perspective, as well as data composability challenges among the multitude of platforms offering grant-related services. And lastly, we have the evaluation and learning, or so-called retrospective stage, which includes measuring the impact of funded projects, as well as the challenge of actually iterating on what's worked and what hasn't. But do grants have to be this hard? So rather than making metrics-based, data-driven decisions, capital allocators often make decisions based on information that is isolated, low context, anecdotal, and short-term focus. This includes scenarios where either decision makers lack context around previous funding rounds, ecosystem best practices, or overall grant trends and strategies, and basically end up following heuristics or the loudest voices in the room. We believe that this fragmented landscape imposes significant impediments to the ecosystem, including efficiency of decision-making and capital allocation, interoperability between projects and platforms, transparency and accountability of both grant programs and grantees, and ecosystem-wide experimentation and iteration. And for these reasons, we are making the case for an open source ecosystem-wide intelligence layer for Web3 grants. To run through some of the benefits of open data improves the equality of access for both consumers and producers of this information. It improves the verifiability of the data itself, from which we can create more credible analyses and more effective decision-making systems. It promotes greater capture resistance and less vendor lock-in, as anyone can access, use, or copy the data. And lastly, mitigates power concentration risk, as no one party owns the underlying infrastructure. And on the right here, we have our hashtag goals, basically our high-level goals for building the intelligence layer, which includes standardizing grant data from diverse sources, enabling comparative grant analytics, promoting transparent and interoperable ecosystems, and building AI-ready data sets. And now Rashmi will lead you through some of the intelligence layers, core architecture, and technical design.
Thank you, Sam. So this brings us to Open Grants. Open Grants is a composable grants data layer. The reason we took the direction of open data infrastructure is any entity doing this ecosystem grant analysis privately would have enormous advantage and would be able to play out their strategic interests. So with open infrastructure, a composable grants data layer, you can collect grant data from various grant systems from different data sources, and basically streamline the grant reporting, and then collect all of this data, standardize it, and put it into structured data sets. So when all of the grant data from different ecosystems, grant systems, are speaking the same language, you can enable, this enables you to do cross-grant system analysis. So this whole infrastructure uses the metadata specification, which is called DAOP5. This is also extendable so that we don't run into the cookie cutting problem where we lose a bit of context when we only strictly adhere to DAOP5 specified things, fields. And we are building on open source observer, which is the public infrastructure right now, public data infrastructure. And next, why do we need to even standardize this data? Why can't we just like keep on collecting and then compare it? It becomes very difficult to do so when we don't standardize it. When we don't standardize, noise is greater than signal, and it's harder to compare and collaborate. So standardization allows us to have it gives credibility to data, and basically we speak the same language when comparing things. And DAOpify being extensible also, we can also include context-rich metadata. So then next I want to share more on the components of grant data. So basically grant data involves grant system, who is the entity who is providing this grants and everything, and grant pools, how much is the grant pool size, who are the projects that are applying, and the application side of things. And then we have, I want to share more on what of the ecosystem coverage that we have. Also, yeah, before I do that, let me get into data integration approach. In data integration approach, Sam, can you please, next slide? So in the data integration approach, if you look at grant data, we can have that, we can access grant data through various data sources, some of that being API, and some of it being static files, and some of it not accessible at all, and just managed by grant managing platforms. For API integrations, we are able to provide like real-time standardized data ingestion, where we provide a gateway API where you have one query interface, and then you just need to name which grant system you want to get the data from, and then you get the standardized data. With static file ingestion, these are for grant systems where grant data is managed on multiple platforms, and they collect it on maybe Airtable and maybe on Google Sheets or anything, where for them we have CSV and JSON files where we can kind of archive the data and run our transformers to standardize it into DAOpify. And for grant managers, for example, Questbook, they put up their own /DAOpify endpoints where if they don't provide access to their grant data, but they do provide an open endpoint of their grant data structured according to DAOpify. So these are the different data integrations approach we've went about for open grants. And then next, the ecosystems that we've covered are 6, and it being Stellar, Cello, Giveth, Octant, Optimism, and Questbook. So this is a dense technical architecture diagram. Basically, the gist of it is where we have different data sources. Everything is pulled into DAOpify transformed data, and then it gets placed into Grant Data Lake according to their own components. And all of this data is pulled into a data service layer. For real-time data, we have Gateway API, and for archived standardized data sets, which can be used by researchers or any analysis that we can do, they are in Data Lake, like BigQuery and stuff. I also wanted to highlight that we see Karma as a project identity provider. One of the things one of the challenges that we encounter when collecting grant data widely is that there's no single adoptable way to identify projects. There's no unique identification for projects. But since Karma Gap is one of the widely adopted grant accountability protocol, we have most projects listed there, and they have their own project identity system. What we do is, if we find any project in the application, we search for it in Karma. We match the project ID and include it. So this allows us to do downstream attribution, where we can later on kind of collect projects like with this project ID map out which projects belong to which ecosystems and where did they get funding from, and etc. So yes, thank you, Monty. Yeah, I was just speaking about Karma and ReFi side of things. And then we plan to also build analytics dashboard. So right now we have Gateway API up and running live. And we also recently integrated Givi into the data lake. So we have Givi's data in our data lake. So pulling this all into a visualized dashboard where we can actually see things and do some analysis, do some fun things. We can analyze things like what is the correlation between grant size and the engagement with QF. Or if the grant size is small, does QF engagement drop out, or things like that? Which is one of the reasons which we're doing all of this grant data collection and analysis. And then, so next up, so I wanted to just briefly share the privacy dilemma. We are open data advocates, but we cannot force everyone to be open data advocates, and not all grant data can be public. We recognize that, and there are various reasons why grant systems choose to keep their grant data private, some of it being anchoring biases, political pressures, and sensitive projects and everything. And also some see grant data as like competitive data, and if sharing that might create competitive disadvantage. And this will always be there. And so, and when our vision is to do ecosystem-wide grant analysis, if 60% of the grant systems have made their data public and 40% of the grant systems keep their grant data private, it really won't be ecosystem-wide analysis. So we really need to accommodate these privacy-conscious organizations too, and combine them both. And we can't just look at fully transparent grant organizations and then just say, oh, this is ecosystem-wide analysis. So, which brings me to question, like, can we identify what are the privacy needs of grant organizations? I also wanted to introduce privacy configuration matrix, where at level 0, we see all of the grant data made public. Basically, here, grant data is who funded whom, how much, and when. And there's also a loosely associated category like, oh, is the project open source or not? Or which category does it belong to? Is it gaming? Is it infrastructure, etc.? And we also see different levels here where one organization might want to only share whom they funded and etc. and be anonymous funders, and some other organization want to protect recipients but want to share the funding amount. Maybe like this also might be helpful to share their treasury information and everything. And as we go down to these levels, this grant data becomes more nuanced. So the vision is where we'd be able to publicly, so the vision is we'd be able to analyze both public data and private data, like through tools like ZK stuff, and combine them together and analyze it. When the grant analysis will be different when we do only fully transparent data and when we combine them. But I feel that it's still valuable, and we'd still be able to provide insights into categorical funding, like, hey, in this quarter, gaming projects got funded 15 million or whatever. So with that, yeah, I would want to pass over to Sam, and he can share a few more things.
Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, so as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm just going to wrap up quickly here in the last couple minutes we have. One of the key takeaways here is open verifiable data as Web3's competitive advantage, and one that we need to better leverage to improve our funding practices. Here I want to point out some of the things that an intelligence layer for grants and ecosystem funding can facilitate. So the first one is knowledge translation, which is actually something Mike talked about this morning, kind of this translation from data into information to knowledge, and essentially simplifying complex data into actionable information. We have robust reporting, which then communicates this information to relevant stakeholders and the wider community. New opportunities for analysis, such as cross-program or longitudinal analyses, which can then inform ecosystem best practices. These can be in regards to evaluation criteria, funding benchmarks, and impact measurement. Cross-platform integrations are super interesting as well, as an intelligence layer opens up access for consuming funding data through gateway APIs like Rashmi mentioned, which enables efficiencies in application reviews and performance monitoring, as information about the grantees only needs to be reported once and can then be used across different programs and platforms. And lastly, collaborative learning, where each individual funding system is able to better learn from and build on top of the experiences of others. This will help us scale faster and innovate more efficiently. And as you can see, efficiency gains are a huge piece of what makes this intelligence layer so valuable. This slide, I'm actually just going to really just skip through. You can see in terms of decision-making, capital allocation, experimentation, and innovation, just the different ways that an intelligence layer can improve the efficiency of Web3's decentralized decision-making and funding environment. So next slide, please. And now this is probably the most fun slide, not because of the visual, but it's time to imagine what we can build on top of an intelligence layer for Web3 grants. So we've already talked a little bit about ecosystem benchmarks and frameworks based upon actual grant rounds and funding experience, rather than relying on heuristics or anecdotal data. But there's also analytics dashboards, with which Rashmi mentioned before, which can be built either for public display, transparency, and accountability, such as like an L2 beat for capital allocation, as well as for internal decision-making tooling for funding ecosystems. We can build actually portable grantee reputations. As we've talked about, the data collected from grantees, both during the application and subsequent reporting processes, can be seamlessly shared between programs and platforms, creating more robust and more portable histories of grantee funding and performance that can be used across programs. We have a more automated application reviews that can identify, flag, and filter potentially high quality or high risk projects. Agentic impact evaluations, which is actually something David was talking about just before this, but training these agents on ecosystem-wide data to progressively improve their performance. And lastly, curated funding registries based on previous funding and performance data that allows funders, which can include DAOs, stakers, validators, etc., to more easily discover and allocate capital to projects they're aligned with, which reduces frictions inherent in decentralized funding. And the last slide is basically just a call to action. If anything that we've presented here has resonated with you, please consider helping to further develop the intelligence layer for Web3 grants. This is truly a community-driven initiative, and let's accelerate progress together. Also on this last slide, if you want to learn more, I included QR code will take you to the DAOstar homepage to learn more about open grants and DAO IP5, and please feel free to reach out.
Thank you, everyone. I'll be answering some of the questions on Twitter directly on your comments, since we're out of time now. I'll pass over the mic. Thank you, Mike. Pass over the mic to Mike.
Pass the mic to Mike.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
I was like, okay, am I saying something else? Yes,
Hey,
thank you.
Didn't plan it, just fortuitous. Yeah. Hey, thank you very much. I am here for the next presentation, and we have Monty with us. Take it away, Monty.
Hello. So I'm going to try and share my screen here. And I think it's come in just now. I hope everyone can hear me. I think you need to get the screen up on stage, Mike. Oh, there it is. Brilliant. Cool. So thank you for having me, the MetaGov crew. I think, DAOstar is doing an excellent job at the kind of collecting and aggregating and standardizing the grants data, how much funding applicants are getting and programs are dispersing, etc. And I'm here to talk about the kind of impact measurement and reporting layer and some of the exciting innovations going on in that direction, and also how this complements some of David's work that he shared earlier around how AI plays a role in this as well. So excited to talk about a common approach to impact measurement in Web3 and bringing impact data on chain. Before we get to that, just a tiny bit of background about me. I'm here in my family home in Dorset. I'm an environmentalist and techie, studied kind of management economics innovation at Bristol, and have been deep in this ReFi space, the regenerative finance ecosystem. I'm one of the co-founders of ReFi DAO. I help lead Celo public goods, allocating grant ecosystem capital in the Celo ecosystem. There's an initiative called Regen Coordination. And I'm also an advisor, a recent new advisor to Karma Gap. And I think we've got Mahesh here in the audience as well. And we'll definitely be talking a bit about that. And so, yeah, really my mission is to flow more value to regenerate life on Earth. And I think solving and improving our impact measurement and reporting is a key way of getting there. So yeah, this is the quick TLDR of what we're gonna cover in today's kind of lightning talk. But really looking at why does Web3 need this more credible, transparent impact measurement systems and frameworks. And then I'll introduce what I've been going super deep on, called the Common Approach to Impact Measurement, a set of these different modular frameworks that can help us do all these fancy things with impact data, and how we're sort of bringing that framework on chain with Karma Gap, so we can really move to this structured, scalable, evidence-informed funding ecosystems, and also really empower the AI systems with semantic, context-rich data on impact. So yeah, the kind of problem space, I'm sure this whole MetaGov grants panel, everyone's been, there's a lot of problems flying around, we know that, but billions have been allocated in the Web3 space, and how do we actually know it's having the impact that we want it to have? Many projects, but even grant programs themselves don't actually have a clear, don't establish a clear theory of change or an impact thesis, a logic model. And so, much is being distributed, but how do we know it's actually driving those outcomes? And without that kind of impact reporting, we can't have any baseline for kind of learning and improvement. And we can't drive those feedback loops and keep on raising further funding and really doubling down on what works. We need to be able to measure it in order to do that. And so, yeah, how do we do that better and clear kind of problem space that the Web3 ecosystem, but also the wider grant space faces. And yeah, in particular in the Web3 space, I think I'm particularly interested in how do we go beyond just the Web3 bubble and the Web3 native sources of capital to really start to attract governments, philanthropic institutions, other communities and NGOs. And to do that, we kind of need to go beyond some of maybe the language and the metrics and the stuff that we're very familiar with in the Web3 space, and really demonstrate that kind of wider impact understanding. And yeah, this I think is a nice little kind of, in the crypto native sphere, we're very familiar with kind of driving transactions, daily active users, total value locked, and memes and vibes, etc. May be really great for measuring and communicating the impact of Web3 stuff, but that's also not the same as measuring other real world impacts and other kind of higher order outcomes and impacts. And the traditional grants and philanthropic space has lots of different frameworks and methodologies around this, theories of change, the Sustainable Development Goals, all sorts of other impact measurements and surrounding kind of frameworks. And so how do we kind of bring both of those pieces together to both measure Web3 impact, but also higher order and other outcome level impacts of all of the projects that all of us in this space are doing? And yeah, one of the key challenges there is that not everything can be measured on chain. On-chain software is great because you can pull a lot of that data kind of, from directly on chain. But when you're trying to measure social, environmental, or higher level ecosystem level impacts, it's even harder to do. There's a lot of kind of qualitative, highly context specific, narrative driven context that is important there. And so we need to kind of have better measurement tools and better ways of getting that data that are both kind of flexible enough to embrace the complexity, but also structured enough to be able to actually scale and aggregate and make this impact data comparable and interoperate across all of our different apps and systems. So yeah, that's kind of the challenge problem space that I've been super interested in. And so maybe we can explore where might we go from here. And so, yeah, happy to introduce this framework I've been going super deep on called the Common Approach to Impact Measurement. And it's basically a set of about 4 different modular kind of standards that help organizations and grant operators measure, improve, and communicate their impact. And crucially, it's trying to address that long-standing tension in the impact measurement space between having like a uniformity where you say, hey, all of you projects that I'm funding, you must measure your impact in this very rigid way, and these are the metrics you need to do, and you fill it out like this, which is obviously good for the funders because they get the data that they need, but actually can create a lot of challenges for the projects themselves, can be a huge burden, and kind of you lose that flexibility, that bottom-up kind of sense making as to which metrics and how do I want to report my impact of what I'm doing. So how do we balance those two things, which is a very common challenge. And yeah, ultimately this goal to create this impact measurement system that's very credible and improving the capital allocation and overall ecosystem. So this is the Common Approach website, and you can see I quite like this graphic. They visualizing have all these different shapes and forms of different purpose organizations and the various impact data that they may have, and kind of streamlining that and sort of processing that in a way that it makes it legible even to funders and other ecosystem actors. And yeah, a bit more context around the Common Approach. This isn't something that came out of the Web3 space. It has a much wider conceptual and academic and underpinning, born out of Canada's social innovation ecosystem, has backing by Canada's government, and co-developed with hundreds of social purpose organizations to really develop this framework with a lot of rigor. And it's built on some of the core and foundational concepts that are widely recognized in the impact measurement and management space for kind of core concepts of how do you actually do the practice of impact measurement and management. And so, you know, very quickly on that, there's this concept of the kind of impact model, kind of logic model that is typical when you're looking at the process of creating impact. You have the kind of input, the resources that come in, the funding, the human labor, etc. That goes into an activity like actually doing something, building some software, hosting an event, doing all the things that you actually do. And those activities create some form of outputs like the deliverables, the MVP software you shipped, the actual event that ran, and certain metrics like how many people attended or how many people are using your app, etc. Those are the kind of outputs. But ultimately, the impact is the outcomes. What happened as a result? What changed in the world, hopefully in a positive way, as a result of all of those activities. And so we have this kind of impact value chain in a way. And also there's this kind of wide set of impact management norms around, you know, what was the impact, who did the impact, how much impact was there, how much was your individual contribution towards creating that impact, and what are the risks? So that's also a widely recognized concept and both foundational to this Common Approach. And so what is the Common Approach? Well, I mentioned these 4 different interoperable standards. So here they are as a kind of overview. And today we're really going to cover the common foundations and the Common Impact Data Standard, because those are the 2 we've really been working to bring into this Web3 space and into Web3 grant systems. So let's get into it. Let's start with the foundations. And so, yeah, this is a framework. But what are the core foundations for thinking about impact measurement, and both from the kind of grantee perspective, but also from the grant program perspective? And so at a foundational level, what both need to do is describe what they're trying to change in the world. What is your project trying to do? And what's your theory of change, your thesis? If I do X, this change will happen in the world, this positive impact. And similarly, a grant program wants to articulate its objectives and its logic model for how the funding it allocates will change things in the world. And then you can just try and think about, okay, well, what are the things that I want to measure? What would be a good metric or indicator that I am achieving that intended change? And, you know, also thinking about how do you actually collect that in a way that is easy and makes sense and isn't hugely burdensome, and you're actually able to collect that information. Yeah, obviously from the grant program point of view, you can also, you know, make it easier for projects to report the data in certain ways by supporting them and building software that can help that. And then ultimately you then need to gauge the performance, what actually happened. Did it meet or exceed or underperform what you were trying to do? And that helps you then course correct, both as a project, change what I'm doing to try and get the impact, or as a program, route resources in a different direction. And ultimately, communicate, use those results, etc. Just a quick note, I am running quite fast. There's quite context-heavy, text-heavy slides. I will happily share my slides if people want more time to kind of read and digest any of it. But I realize I'm running up on time already, so need to move relatively quickly. I just wanted to include this slide in there as well. I think collecting useful information is important. You don't need to report everything, but actually look for where the signal is. Where are the really important metrics that you can actually measure, that's not a huge burden, that really provide that signal that you're having the impact you're having. So that's quite a kind of skill to find out what that is. And just a note on common approach. It's not telling you exactly what to measure, but actually it's a set of wise practices about how to measure and how to go about this whole space, both for projects and for grant program designers. So how are we trying to implement this common foundations? Well, in KarmaGap, we're in the process of building a kind of program builder for anyone who wants to start a grants program or distribute capital, to guide people in helping to think of their program's impact thesis, their theory of change, what stakeholders are relevant, and what kind of indicators that the projects that they're funding, should report to, and set those expectations and follow up, etc. And so really be able to design what the program and the kind of thesis behind it. And then once that's kind of the template, you can reuse that across other grant programs. So we might, come up with this is a model that could really be applied over here and over here. And so this program builder feature, I'm very excited to see come to life. So once you've got your program, you've got your grant program set up, you've thought about what your theory of change is and what you're trying to do in the world, you now need to have the actual system in place to be able to measure and see what's going on and see what the projects you funded are doing. And so that's where this common impact data standard comes in. It provides a kind of data structure, semantic data structure, that allows the reporting of impact in these kind of core impact model, input, activity, output, outcome, and these other kind of concepts, to be able to gather that from the data. And so instead of, I often sometimes see people present their impact in a great PDF, or maybe they have a spreadsheet or a Notion thing where they're keeping track of what they're doing. Fine, maybe for an individual project, but we need a way at an ecosystem level or at a program level to be able to kind of aggregate and interoperate all of these various impact reports across a whole portfolio of different projects that might have received funding. And so Common Impact Data Standard, or CIDS, is a way of doing that in a way that makes it super machine readable. And in that way, one of the amazing use cases of that is that AI is much better than able to understand the deep context and relationality between all of the different objects of data that are being reported, which is super important for the future that we're heading into. And so, this slide, I don't want it to scare anyone too much, but it just kind of shows, I think, the sophistication of the Common Impact Data Standard under the hood, and all of the different classes of different types of data that you could collect that would help add to an overall picture of being able to really measure impact. I think you'd only use all of these classes if you were maybe allocating millions and millions of dollars and it was a huge program. So for other programs, you can actually, there's a sort of more basic set of, this is the core informations that I need to measure impact, and you can sort of scale up the complexity as well is required. And so, we are also implementing and already have started implementing a Common Impact Data Standard within KarmaGap to provide all of that functionality that I mentioned. And essentially the result of that is this kind of on-chain impact knowledge graph, which we hope will provide a new level of transparency and accountability for the Web3 grants space. So going a little bit from the theory to actually what does that look like in practice? Well, right now you can go into KarmaGap and submit an activity report, and essentially what that activity report is, here's an example of one from ReFi DAO, and we're reporting the funding rounds that we helped run during GG23. And you know, the first part of that is the activity report. What did we do? When did we do it? And then the crucial is the outputs from that. You know, you can then see the documentation that we created for the round as some of the output deliverables, but also some of the metrics, like we ran a workshop with it, how many people attended, how many projects did we fund, the kind of key outputs. So that's a really good way of then getting to, you know, seeing what the projects are actually doing. And then ultimately what you want to do is say, okay, these were the outputs that, you know, say we take the example of ReFi DAO. We have a network of local nodes, we call them, local communities across the globe that are doing something impactful. And say each of these local nodes may be submitting their activities and outputs, what each of them are doing. They're hosting events, they're running funding rounds, they're implementing regenerative projects. And then at the kind of program level, we can actually aggregate what's going on. We can say, actually, across all of our projects that we funded, how many events have they hosted? How many on-chain members are there? And those outputs can then be used to create evidence for the outcomes or the actual impact we're having. We're growing ReFi awareness or growing Web3 adoption, that kind of change in the world, the outcomes. And so right now it's still in development, final few touches, but building the capability to do that kind of aggregation and evidenced outcome chain within Karma Gap as well. So programs can really demonstrate to funders how the funds are causing the outcomes that the funders want to see. So I'm almost coming up at time, but that's good because I'm almost there. And yeah, this is just a sort of another example of that, but in the kind of, I mean, many people in this space are software development projects. And so this is just, you know, putting that into contextualization there. You know, the activity might be you're developing and launching some form of decentralized governance tool. The outputs there would be, you've developed the app, here's the working product. There's 1,000 users on it, 3 DAOs have implemented it. And then what are the outcomes from that? And that might be, you know, the short-term outcomes of making it easier for DAOs to govern, basically. And the longer-term outcomes, maybe it actually improves the whole DAO space and participation, and more people start launching DAOs because you've made the experience so much better. And that's, you know, impact you've had that's more ecosystemic through the work that you've done. And yeah, sometimes impact measurement frameworks like to separate out impacts from outcomes. But actually, this framework really sees that the outcomes are the impact. What changed in the world, whether it's short-term or long-term, is the impact that your project is having. And ultimately, once we have all of that data on all of the activities, the outputs and the outcomes, and all of the different projects that are being funded, it becomes an amazing source of intelligence to run AI models through. And I know David Dow's talk was just before this. And we've been working together as well, feeding that data and kind of creating all sorts of fancy and exciting AI agent evaluation models. I think it's a kind of new era for capital allocation, combining rich impact data with advanced AI. And instead of kind of you apply to a grant program, you get no feedback and you just get a no, you can get a really detailed analysis of, you know, and feedback and strengths, weaknesses, recommendations, etc. So I think it really is a game changer there. And we'll finish off with just some of the lessons that we've learned, core lessons that you know, I know Mahesh is on the call here. We've been really knocking our heads together for quite a time now, and definitely learned some lessons along the way. I think there's still a lot to overcome in terms of overcoming the conceptual confusion that there still is around what class is an activity versus an output versus an outcome, and how should I report it in my in the best way. So that's one. There's also very much the data collection challenge. You know, does take time and effort to manually enter this data in, and you have to trust that the data is correct. And you know, how do we then design more automation to be able to pull this from on-chain or from other sources and make the whole data collection process easier and smoother. There still is that uniformity versus flexibility trade-off. You know, we do want to aggregate stuff at the level, but we also want to provide the flexibility for people to measure impact and report in a way that makes most sense to them. And with the AI stuff, you know, yes, you can have all of this wonderful data, etc., but it's still, to actually implement that into a program requires, you know, quite careful prompt design and rubrics and sort of a smart way of actually really putting that into context and getting the process that you want to do those AI evaluations. And finally, that kind of last process that I discussed around the impact aggregation is still quite a challenging process. If you've got 50 projects that you funded in your program and each one has reported all these different activities and outputs, and you're trying to come up with sort of ways of aggregating and coming up with these higher level things, that can be quite a challenging process sometimes, especially when people are using different metrics to measure different things. So yeah, happy to jam on that more. I'm very much coming to the end in my last few slides, but this is kind of putting all of what I discussed into a visual element here. And I've used the kind of organizations I'm involved in, regen coordination, all the different impact projects that are there, doing their impact reporting into this system. And then we have various forms of ReFi and Web3 tooling, which can also help do some automatic reporting. All of that feeds into this common approach standard empowered by the Karma Gap platform. And then ultimately that allows us to both kind of translate that into some of these other standards. And that's a really important thing if we want to attract, say, institutional capital using the Sustainable Development Goals or these other frameworks. And ultimately, hopefully that allows us to attract more funders and more funding into these systems. And so we can increase the amount of total value flowed and the channeling of financial resources towards impact and measuring that impact and thus unlocking more funding. So that's the flows that we're really trying to unlock with this system, or certainly I'm particularly interested in from my work. And so final piece, I'll finish on a call to action. If you're a grantee or a project, go to Karma Gap, fill out an activity report, let us know how you find it, how we can improve it. And if you're a founder, an app builder, a program builder, how might your work plug into Common Impact Data Standard and Karma Gap? We're definitely always looking for more integrations and other ways to kind of align. So do reach out. Thank you very much. I definitely have gone over time. I'll try answer some questions in the chat if I can. But thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you on that. Yeah, I think you've got the right approach. We'll have to answer questions in chat, but thank you for that, Monty. That was awesome. All right, we are going to send it back over to Rashmi, who's going to introduce our next presenter.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. And next up, we have Ben from Octant speaking about qualitative Web3 grants data and its limitations. On to you, Ben. Thank you.
Thanks, Rashmi. Hi, everyone. My name is Ben. I'm a managing director at Octant. It's a small firm based out of Germany. We do a variety of things in research and development, but also in Web3. And this is what led me to this talk. Beyond the numbers, quantitative Web3 grants data and its limitations. And really, we heard it in the previous presentation that some Web3 programs or even Web3 funders and perhaps even Web3 grantees want to explore other funding options, want to perhaps extend their reach beyond Web3, or perhaps want to bring outside capital into Web3. Now, that might sound simple, but it also can be complicated. So that's why I'll go into sharing our experiences with working with capital coming outside of Web3, very traditional government-funded, government-backed grants, and share our learnings that we made or that we discovered from applying the grant maturity framework to a program or to a project that is Web3 native, but was funded and developed with outside Web3 funding. Now, to keep this a bit interactive, I want to ask the audience, what do these projects have in common? So NIM is doing a decentralized VPN. They also launched a token. We have Claris here, and we have DAppNode. Perhaps some of you have one at home. And really, like these three projects, and perhaps some of you know, they all received grants from the EU. And having been in EU grants and having applied for government grants outside of Web3, but for Web3 projects, you really are blown away by the amount of documentation and project data that is available, that is collected, but perhaps also used in a misguided way. So when you're measuring success as a mature funder, for the case, or in the case of the EU, you can see that here you have projects that are targeted at Web3. So there's a whole table of projects that have overlap with blockchain and Web3 that were funded by the European Union. And you have overall a cost of 188 million euros that went into blockchain funding by the EU over the last 10 years. And when you look at the funded projects, these can either be individual projects. So in the case of the EU, we would be talking about a Horizon project. So this is usually a consortium of 3, 4, 5 entities building a multi-months or multi-year project. Or that can be a cascade funding. That means that a consortium comes together, they apply for funds, they take a portion of the funds for operations and for dissemination objectives. So to really make what they're doing known to the world and kind of apply the funding. But the majority of the funding goes to smaller grantees. So really what happens is you have a big consortium, they get a large chunk of money from the European Union, they cut it up and basically apply it and distribute it to smaller grants. And in this category, we're talking about 100,000, maybe 120 up to 200,000 per project that is funded in these cascade funding or through this cascade funding mechanism. And what you're getting when you're keeping track of all of this, and the entire funding process, we'll get into that in a minute, is very bureaucratic. But when you do all of that, when you track every single detail, and you have a grant application process that doesn't just make you fill out the form, but actually has an interview attached, and you keep track of all this data, you end up with a really nice grant data standard for European projects, where you can see how much is allocated to who or which time frame, and you get this very rich data. So fun fact, all of these are DAOs. So this is a data standard for academic reporting as well. So whenever you publish something in an academic journal, you get this reference number, which is uniform. So you can, whenever you type that in, you will be led to the original source. So really, the EU is doing a really good job at keeping track of all bits and pieces, of all data sources, of all grantees and the outcomes that they have achieved over the project period. But this is also coming at a price. So when we look at the overhead for the individual grantee, we're starting with a 7 to 10 pages proposal per, give or take 100,000 euros in funding. This 7 to 10 pages proposal will have to go through 3 to 5 independent reviewers. And as a grant program manager, remember, you want to have independent reviewers, and you want to get them to actually review it. So you have to post a call, you need to interview them, you need to actually get them in. And now over a 10 to 12 month project period for 100,000 euro grant, these projects will produce around 400 pages of reporting per project. In a cascade funding project cluster, you might have 10 to 15 projects per year or per funding cycle. So overall, we're talking about at least 40 to maybe 70 projects. So multiply this number of 400 by this number, and you get close to the reporting data that is produced by projects during their project lifecycle, when they're actually producing outcomes and outputs. So on the left, we see an example how this might look. Right in the back, you see a questionnaire that is usually prompted at the end of a project period, where a project will have to fill out all the KPIs, how they achieved it, why they achieved it, what the next steps are. In the middle, I know it's perhaps not ideal how this is displayed, but in the middle you see an evaluation result. So when an interview or when a proposal is being done, you basically get a score for subcategories. There's also qualitative data, and for each report, remember these 400 pages in total. Maybe every quarter you'll submit a report, or your grantees will submit a report to the European Union. You'll get an evaluation report. So these are again 3 to 5 independent reviews for each deliverable report, and they're producing over a project lifecycle 50 pages of reporting per project. So again, you can multiply this to get an idea of what a really mature grant program would look like if you want to get all the data that you possibly can get and kind of make it visually appealing and accessible in the way that is being discussed by some other presenters during that conference. So really, you have kind of two options. You can run with a really lean program structure, or you can fulfill your hunger for data and collect as much as possible. So what we're seeing is that setting up and running a mature funding program will consume a significant portion of the funds that are available for your funding. So, don't take 10%, don't take 20%, maybe, take 30 to 35% of the funding that you have available that will just go to fulfill reporting requirements. And in order for you to collect all this data, you also need grantees who are able to actually satisfy your requirements for reporting. So forget about this small project that has like this moonshot idea, who are just a couple people trying to make this work, because they will not be able to, or they will not score highly in your reporting scheme, and therefore they will fall out of the program before they could even produce any impact or outcomes. Further, all the grantees that made it in, they will spend a significant amount of the awarded funds on operations and reporting. If they would have had the funds for actually, compiling all of this and documenting and disseminating and making all of this visible, they wouldn't be applying for grants, like 100%. So whatever money, whatever funds, whatever capital you allocate to grantees, while at the same time also requiring them to document what they're doing, they will spend a part of that money to fulfill your reporting requirements. There's no way around it. And that means that all your impact that you're wanting to achieve and that you want to have documented might be diminished by the amount of reporting that you impose on your grantees. So, is it really worth it? That's the question that you need to ask when you are setting up your funding program, when you set up a grant program. Because, at the end of the day, the performance data that you're getting might not give you the answers that you're looking for. Yes, of course, they may improve your long-term success. They might improve how you measure outputs and outcomes. They might help you make your impact more visible. But to actually measure impact, you will have to collect even more data later on, because at the end of the project lifecycle, at the end of the funding lifecycle, you need to take a snapshot, and then after a period of time, you need to come back and need to see whether these outcomes and outputs actually produce the impact that was promised in the beginning and kind of evolved. So really, more data only produces more hunger for data. And none of the data that you're going to collect is going to guarantee you that you're going to make better grant decisions today or tomorrow. Rather, it's going to help you make better grant decisions next cycle, in 2 years, in 3 years. So really, do you actually want to run a mature grant program today? Like, is that what you want to do with the funds that you have available? This question you need to ask yourself when setting up a grant program, when maybe breaking out a smaller portion of funds that you have available that you want to allocate to a certain niche or to a certain theme. So if you were to do that, we have devised the grant maturity framework, which actually helps you score that. So there are 40 data points and a Delphi-based qualitative rubric scoring that help you focus on areas of governance, effectiveness, program structure, but also collect all the quantitative data points that help you make quantitatively better decisions. And this is then scored according to maturity. So how effective is the program in funding the right things and operating efficiently with the available funds? And when you have these data points and you can calculate maturity, you can actually group your grant program in experimental, developmental, foundational, and advanced. And it's really okay to say this is an experimental or a developmental grant program. We're going to try things out. We tried this for 4 different programs, tested it. Arbitrum did a really good job in some respects, and others, more recent grant programs, might have more room to improve. And before you're not, super bearish about funding in Web3, it's actually doing well. We didn't have the 30, 40, 50, 60 years of some government grant programs under our belt yet in setting this up. So for the decade that we're doing that, we're actually doing quite well. So what's next? We need to acknowledge that we might not want to run a mature funding program. So acknowledging that we are running this as an experiment will actually help. We also need to focus on inclusivity and access, because otherwise we're going to risk on missing out on quality projects. In a more recent qualitative study that we've done, there was someone who reported who gets held accountable and who doesn't is actually very political. If you have influence in funding, people sometimes won't say anything. So really addressing this is not just a matter of, implementing some policies, but actually putting the money where our mouth is when we want Web3 to be more inclusive and open. So grant programs can be successful. They're just one funding tool. So remember, when you're setting this up, you don't need to go for a grant program just because everyone else does. There are great tools and mechanisms out there that are not named grants that actually get the job done. And yeah, with this, consider differentiating and not just focusing on one of the buzzwords that are out there, and stay true to yourself. If you're not the European Union, you might not want to make a grant program model after the European Union, but really keep it scrappy and keep it effective and keep it small, because that makes also a more appealing grant programs to funders and to grantees, because you're true to yourself and you actually live within your means and don't produce data that you cannot capture and cannot analyze and won't need in 1 year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for sharing your work, and it's been amazing. And it's really helpful for us to categorize grant programs into the 4 categories that were mentioned. It provides us more insights. Up next, we are at time. I would love for you to answer questions in chat and on Twitter. Up next, we have Elliot from Koala Pay sharing us insights about real-world impact from Stellar Community Foundation.
Great, thank you. Can you see my screen? All right, thanks everyone. My name is Elliot Seeger. I work with a company called Koala Pay. that was started a few years ago by a group of humanitarians, and I'll give you some more detail on that shortly. But I am based in Nairobi, Kenya. I've been here for almost 6 years, and I've been doing evaluation of development and humanitarian aid projects for the last 15 years or so across the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia for donors, including USAID, the European Union, and others that I think have also been mentioned recently. And we are collaborating with the Stellar Development Foundation and the Stellar Community Fund to look at measuring the real-world impact of Web3 grants. And there's been some really fascinating, really interested to hear more in terms of those that are on this call. So I'll run through this, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So I think, as will not be a surprise to you, the challenge often is that Web3 grants are diverse and global, which makes coming up with a consistent, uniform framework quite challenging across all of them. The ecosystem growth also happens at many layers, and this can be quite tricky in terms of coming up with metrics that meet each of those different categories. And then also the real world user outcomes are often the hardest to capture. And that can be for a variety of reasons, particularly in terms of actually being able to engage with users in a way that's data sensitive and that kind of protects their identities and also allows them to respond in a way that provides for anonymity. And also just people generally have survey fatigue and are often hesitant or reluctant to engage with these types of assessments based on our experience. So why does impact matter? I think, as many of you have already pointed out, this goes beyond just technical milestones of the grants themselves, but helps us understand how these different grant applications truly benefit users, particularly those in underserved communities, especially when you're looking at financial inclusion and trying to expand that across these target locations. Also, it demonstrates the key aspects of financial inclusion, which is what we're looking at through the Stellar Community Fund across parameters like access, affordability, trust, and usability. And it also helps partners themselves who are participating in the assessments learn how to kind of better tell their story and really highlight the outcomes and impacts that they're having on the ground within the communities that they're working in. So who we are. So KoalaPay, as I said, was founded several years ago by a group of ex or ongoing humanitarians that I would count myself a part of. We're a team of about 20 individuals based in different areas, but all working on humanitarian crisis contexts. And the idea was, how can we use blockchain Web3 technology and digital payments to help get resources and funding to local partners working in some of the most challenging humanitarian contexts globally. So the platform itself uses smart contracts and a combination of stable coins and other payment rails to enable programmable borderless payments and make it easy for donors to access these platforms to do KYC and vetting, and to ultimately save time and money getting cash and other resources to local partners working in emergency crises and other humanitarian contexts. We're also working with the Stellar Development Fund to help achieve its mission of financial inclusion, particularly within some of these more difficult areas that I mentioned before. One key aspect of KoalaPay is we are keen to integrate impact measurement across all of the work that we're doing by gathering real-world impact data from beneficiaries, from participants, from end users through different methods, but mainly via our tailored Billy app, which I'll tell you a bit more about in a second. So some examples of our work include currently we are delivering humanitarian aid in terms of cash payments to vulnerable households in conflict-affected areas of Sudan in partnership with the Danish Refugee Council. We've also been running a year-long pilot in Somalia to enable rapid responses to climate shocks, particularly flash floods and drought in partnership with the Norwegian Refugee Council as part of an anticipatory action program using smart contracts linked to climate data that will immediately disperse and release funding to local partners so they can respond rapidly in those contexts. And as I mentioned before, we're monitoring and evaluating these activities using the Billy app that can be installed on users' phones or that can be accessed through a variety of different channels. And we try and boost participation in the impact assessments by providing incentives through a digital wallet that's integrated within the app itself that I'll tell you a bit more about in a second. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to develop a practical framework for measuring impact using tools like this app and others that can be applied across the Stellar Development Foundation's grantees. And as part of this, we're sampling 5 initial partners and developing tailored impact frameworks to their work based on a sampling criteria. So this is a pretty straightforward method. We are starting with a desk review that we've already conducted in terms of literature and the existing sources out there, including MetaGov's handbook around evaluating Web3 grants, looking at the Grant Maturity Index, and also work that PwC has done with Stellar previously around developing a portfolio corporate level impact framework. We've also been doing partner consultations, and right now we're in the process of collaboratively developing these impact frameworks for each partner through theories of change, survey questionnaires, and also engagement strategies. This is going to continue between now and October. And so the next steps are around gathering feedback on our strategy, and we've had some really great feedback from MetaGov already. Developing these tailored frameworks that then will feed into customized Billy app platforms for each partner. We'll deploy the app across the user base through the different 5 partners that we're working with, and then begin collecting data from them over the next 2 months, which will then synthesize into a joint impact report at the end of the study. So here's a little glimpse into the Billy app. It's intended to look like a game in some contexts where users may be concerned about scrutiny from government or other actors in difficult humanitarian contexts, but it allows AI embedded chat as well as push surveys to respondents. So I talked a little bit about frameworks that already exist, so we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. So this is an example of the PwC framework at the corporate and portfolio level that's been developed for the Stellar Development Foundation. And we basically have tried to derive our real world impact framework from things like this and other resources that MetaGov has also been thinking on as well. So these are the categories that we have been looking at in terms of real world impact. They're not exhaustive by any means, but we look at financial access as inclusion, usability and adoption of the solution itself, any affordability and cost savings related to users engaging with the app or the grant, economic empowerment as a result of that engagement, and also levels of trust, satisfaction, and perceived transparency among users. So this is just an example of a basic theory of change that we've developed with one of the partners. This is also going to be fleshed out into more detail as kind of a multi-tiered framework, but this is kind of to get the conversation going with them to get a sense of how we'll assign indicators and metrics across that work. And here's some examples of those metrics here. So if you look at financial access inclusion, you'll see we're looking at percentage of users without prior access to digital wallets, looking at their ability to engage with banking services in some cases or financial services where they weren't able to before, particularly those in underserved or unbanked communities. And then we have similar metrics across these other key categories in terms of reduced transaction fees, how that money is actually being used. In some cases, we've heard from users around being able to use funding for education, to pay off loans, for emergency healthcare needs, and also to be able to actually lift communities out of different socioeconomic tiers in certain instances. So really interested to kind of see what other feedback we get as part of this process as it comes in. So the key takeaways here we have obviously is impact measurement is essential. And I think what we're trying to demonstrate here is being able to do it at the last mile among end users is really critical in terms of feeding up into those broader frameworks that you've been talking about today. And hopefully this pilot will be a replicable model that we can then scale, and there'll be hopefully a wealth of lessons learned that can be applied across other similar portfolios and similar grant mechanisms. And hopefully some of this can also be built into MetaGov's own thinking on some of this work and its upcoming Web3 grants handbook revisions. So I will stop rambling there and see if we have any time for questions.
Awesome, thank you. Let me pull up some questions. I had a question for you. I wanted to know what's your favorite user story of someone using Quality, and how's it been going?
Sure. Well, I think recently we've seen some participants of some of the assistance that we provided in Myanmar, particularly those that have been residing in areas of Kachin that have been cut off from the rest of the country because of the conflict between ethnic armed groups and the national government, who previously were not able to access aid. And through the KoalaPay platform, we were able to disperse aid through digital payment rails into some of those areas of Kachin that they couldn't access before. And so we were able to provide several $1,000s for one community to actually buy school books and textbooks for students in that area that had been kind of out of school for the last 6 months. And they were also able to access through the Billy app some resources through AI to ask questions about some of the climate shocks in their areas and other issues that could affect those communities. So I think those were some of the more interesting stories that we've heard.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, I love what you've shared, and we've had a lot of impact talk, and thank you for sharing about stellar work. With this, we're at time. I would love for you to answer any questions in chat or on Twitter. I would like to bring up our next speaker now, who is Angela from GovAccess and Token Engineering Academy.
Hi, everyone.
Hi,
hi, Rashmi. Hi, MetaGov. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll present designing metrics-based grants for verifiable impact today. Let me just find my slides. Yeah, and the agenda today, just to give you an overview of what I'll present, we'll discuss how to separate value judgments in votings from performance data for projects in the context of grants. We'll discuss and learn more about the strategic implementation of metrics-based funding. And I would love to get your input as well. I have 3 questions, and if you like, drop your answers in the chat if you're following this presentation via X. How do you define and measure impact today? I'll bring metric scores, but you might use different methods. So how do you define and measure impact today? Another question I'd like to have the audience input is how to select and evaluate good metrics. Following the presentation, you might have ideas. And finally, how do you or would you address different kinds of strategic voting and manipulation schemes? Because that's always a challenge in all our voting designs when it comes to grants. Let's take a look. First, let me give an introduction for the GovAccess team. I'm a member of the GovAccess team. I'm Angela Kreitenweiss. I founded the Token Engineering Academy, which is the design, verification, and optimization of token-based system combining computer science, economics, game theory, network science, and governance. And my colleagues at GovAccess are Nimrod Talman, professor at the Ben Gurion University, Eyal Bremen, and Muhammad Idris. And we are working on voting designs, social choice theory in crypto land. So we did an evaluation of Optimism's retro funding design. We are now working on metrics-based voting, a new paradigm in DAO decentralized decision making. And you can learn more about our work on mirror.xyz. You can simply Google it. GovXS is the name of our team. And you can follow me at X, AKRTWS, where I regularly post about metrics-based voting and whatever you might be interested in, and we don't have the time to cover it in the 20 minutes today, you'll find it there. All right, let's kick it off. The challenge. You might have heard about crypto protocols, grants, systems. So there are a lot of programs running that should help crypto ecosystems grow. So award builders building on chain, award developer tools, award interesting applications on top of crypto protocols. And the amounts distributed in such protocols are really significant. So Optimism distributes has allocated 850 million in funding, which was by the time of announcing this grant program, 3.3 billion USD. We have other programs like in the Arbitrum ecosystem, 200 million Arbitrum tokens, which is an equivalent of, I think, by the time of announcement, 600 million USD. The Polygon program, 1 billion Polygon tokens, which is 600 USD in fiat value. So really huge programs, and many of these programs distribute the funding in votings. As decentralized organizations, the community should have a say in who should get these grants and how the funding should be distributed. But we have some challenges here. Many grant programs have been criticized as for being popularity contests. So the loudest and most visible projects receive most funding, or voters are biased and we don't know how they really evaluate projects who apply for grants funding. Or there could be solution among insiders, so like projects, and voters collude, or voters collude in groups to take over the decision making. Or this could be generally a lack of expertise or informed decision making in evaluating sometimes hundreds of projects applying for grants just within a couple of days or weeks, and then take an informed decision who should receive the funding. And metrics-based funding aims to solve these challenges. And in a nutshell, it's ecosystem funding based on measurable value add. Now, a lot of people are talking about, okay, we have measurable impact. What's the idea here? And again, while you're following this presentation, I would be keen to learn more about how do you measure impact, and just drop it in the chat. Okay, how to separate value judgments from measurable value add. There are two sections here that are important to keep in mind. Number one, we combine data, and this is on the left, with subjective preferences of voters on the right. Let's take a closer look on what data are we using here. Now, for crypto protocols, this can be, for example, token value locked. This is a very popular metric for measuring success of protocols. So this is any token value that is locked in applications, in staking, in other forms of locking tokens, so that they can't be spent. And this is an indicator of how interesting, how attractive a protocol is for investors. We also can count active users or active wallets. We can count developer engagements, how many people are building on a protocol. Now, with looking at TVL generally, we can't really measure impact, so we have to be more specific. For TVL, we can, for example, further define this metric in it must be token value locked over the past 180 days, and we measure in native token value as opposed to USD value, for example. Or let's take a look at active users. We can count unique accounts linked to addresses that initiated an event producing a state change with one or more of a project's contracts. And this is a copy of active users counted from an actual metrics-based voting. And I copied it here just to give you an idea. Okay, we have to be way more specific than just say we count wallets. But this, of course, is important to have a clear understanding of what we'd like to see and what we are measuring for positive impact. Or for developer engagement. Here, for example, another real-world specification is engagement of GitHub users with a minimum of 6 active months contributing to one or more projects. This is just to give you some examples of how such a metric can be defined. And we can even combine several metrics into one, as we call it, evaluation algorithm. So this was the left side, objective metrics, evaluation algorithms. And now this is combined with subjective preferences in the community, the voters. And voters in metrics-based funding don't vote on projects. Instead, they vote on metrics. So they give their preferences, how relevant or how important they think a certain metric is for the development of a community, of an ecosystem, and how to best achieve the community's goals. So voters vote on metric weights, and then, since we have usually a lot of voters, we have to aggregate votes, so design how to aggregate these votes into a single outcome. And usually we also add quorums, like a minimum number of votes received, or a normalization method, or a maximum cap. And metric weights can and have to also further defined in, for example, the relative importance a certain metric should have for funds distribution in percent. We aggregate votes on weight, like what we'd like to have. Finally, do we want to have a single winner metric? Do we want to have a weighted combination? Do we combine using the mean, the median, quadratic methods? And quorum is like a minimum of votes, predefined funding amount, maximum allocation per project. All right, these are examples on the right side, and we call this the voting rule, how to define how we aggregate the subjective preferences of the voters. And here we have a screenshot how this can look in reality. This is a prototype used in the optimism retro funding. This is how voters define then, or can define, a percentage of a certain metric, and these individual votes are then aggregated to a single outcome. And based on this outcome, grants are distributed to fund projects to grow the ecosystem. All right, let's quickly check. Do we have any questions so far on X or in the other channels? Just asking the moderator. I would pause for a moment. How do you define and measure impact today? Any thoughts?
Yeah, as we've discussed a lot on impact, and it's been complicated things, and one of the ways that I hear people talking about as attestations and stuff, but again, how do we even attest to things?
Mm-hmm.
So it's
right. Yeah.
It's a hard question, and
it's absolutely a hard question. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then
I think there seems to be a tiny lag. I pause and you continue. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to know how was the approach of bringing this all together?
Yeah, I'll share some examples of the results and how this was designed in one ecosystem. I think generally, metrics-based funding and metrics-based voting is number one, ideal in setups where we can award achievements retroactively, because I mean, metrics-based means we have to be able to measure impact retroactively. And second, of course, it makes sense for activities that are trackable or that are tracked anyways. And as I mentioned, user activity is something we can measure on-chain, if we have on-chain transactions, any forms, if we have smart contracts in place. There are also off-chain transactions that are measurable. For example, activities of developers contributing to open source code. Here we can access GitHub repositories, can measure the forks, can measure how many people contribute, can measure how many commits have been made in a certain time frame, etc. And we can even measure, and this is quite interesting, dependencies between repositories, which are important in context of protocols, where we have the fundamental layers, consensus layers, sometimes layer 2 protocols. Then we have applications built on top. We have dependencies, libraries that are super important for these applications to run and to enable also the developers interacting with smart contracts and quality assurance, etc. So there's a whole ecosystem of software, many times public goods of open source frameworks. And here in these cases, we can start measuring and building up graphs actually to help us find the flows of value in an ecosystem, measure it, and to reward it. And it's quite an exciting area of experimentation also.
That is awesome. But I feel like quantitative data is easily measurable, but what about qualitative data? It's a bit hard to measure, and that's where this self-reporting and stuff comes in. So
true.
I just want to be a bit mindful of time and see.
So if there are no further questions at this point, I would talk briefly about how to implement metrics-based voting, and then I might have the chance to even show some experiments and the results and what we are able to learn from it.
Yes, awesome.
All right.
We have 10 more minutes, so awesome. We would love to know more.
Great. All right, how to implement metrics-based voting? What could be a good approach? How start testing it? First, it's important to discuss the objectives, because there is no good definition of what metrics should we use or is useful to measure impact if we don't have a clear picture of what's the objective of a grant program. What do we want to award? What are activities who really drive value? And without this definition of the purpose and the objectives of an ecosystem, any definition of any of the further steps just falls short. Okay, definition of objectives. Next, what metrics can we use to measure positive impact here? And this is number one, a discussion of, can we quantify positive value add, or how could we quantify things that are not easy to measure today? What approaches can we take, and what data sources can we use? And in the cases that I mentioned with TVL or with users, it's I mean, this is comparably easy and straightforward to measure, but even then it takes some investigation and tests to understand, okay, what's the granularity, for example, of the data sources and of the metrics to measure it. Can we measure it on a monthly base, on a weekly base, on an hourly base, on a minutes base? And what is the best approach to really define these metrics well for funds distribution. So this is the second step. Then we combine these tests and specify the total evaluation algorithm. And then we get to this right side, the voting rule. So how do we collect the subjective preferences of voters? Is it once per funding round? Is it once per 6 months? How many voters do we expect? How are voters selected? How do they vote on a single metric, or will we get a weighted combination, etc.? And in most cases, it's good to run some first tests with this setup, the evaluation algorithm and a voting rule. I've seen a lot of cases where there's a limited amount of funding in 1, 2, 3 first rounds to gain insights, to learn more about the voter behavior and about the algorithms, to really understand if this is something that helps the ecosystem ultimately. Before then, we build the infrastructure for it. For metrics-based funding, we need not only infrastructure to measure and to vote, but also infrastructure to defend. I mean, basically every voting system should have mechanisms in place to defend against malicious behavior, be it collusion or be it just Sybil attacks, whatever. And same case for metrics-based voting, build the infrastructure, build it properly, defend the system, and then roll it out and monitor and continuously optimize the metrics as well as the voting rule. And this whole process is what we call strategic implementation, to really understand well the effects of a certain design to the development of the ecosystem. And so in a nutshell, matrix-based voting is a new type of governance. It has huge potential for better data-driven funds distribution. It requires new infrastructure, which is fit for purpose on the voter side and particularly also on the metric side. And developing and changing evaluation algorithm is hard. You can imagine in regular votings where we just ask a question and then voters say yes or no, it's easier to redefine the goal or the target or the question. If we have an infrastructure that measures the metrics and automatically based on this metric and the voter input defines a funding amount, the infrastructure has to be more sophisticated, and this makes it harder to change. And based on my conversations with program leaders, I learned that this, of course, can be considered as a challenge, but it can also be a feature because the whole community has to think twice about the purpose and about respective metrics. And this is a very productive conversation to really coordinate and be in sync about the purpose of an ecosystem, and also helps projects to better understand what an ecosystem is aiming for. And last but not least, it requires defending against attacks, as mentioned, a proper tool stack in place. Now, if we have some minutes left, I'd like to share some examples. It's just last minute ad, but I think it's really valuable. First results in a setup where metrics-based funding has been applied. And this is at Optimism Retro. I mentioned it already. And the question is, can an evaluation algorithm, these metrics, really catch what the community deems to be valuable? And here, Optimism put up a very good setup. I think this is really a good way to approach it. They, on one hand, implemented a voting-based outcome, just as I presented it, and compared it with an expert evaluation, where experts were asked to assess projects, the same projects like in the voting, in a pairwise comparison. And then the ranking of these expert evaluation was compared with the voting outcome. And the voting was, the community, voters has been asked, okay, what evaluation algorithm is most suitable for our ecosystem, for our funding rounds. This was for rewarding developer tooling in retro funding round 7 in season 7. And there were 3 algorithms with particular goals, with particular ideal scenarios, putting an emphasis either or more on growth or more on retention. And these 3 evaluation algorithms were then put up in a voting, and the voters decided to have Arcturus as the winner algorithm. And based on this algorithm, the actual funds have been distributed to developer tooling in season 7. There was some quorum, and the expert pairwise voting, where invited experts evaluated projects in parallel, was the voters were selected maintainers of the listed projects and 30 community members, and they assessed 69 dev tooling projects. And then the results, a ranking was compared with the community voting outcome. Okay, and now, of course, the question was, do these 2 results differ, and how, and what can we learn? Is metrics-based voting, does it really meet the intentions or the assessment of experts, and where are the deviations? And basically, can the algorithms catch what the community deems to be valuable? This is all open source. You can find it online as well if you'd like to dig deeper. And here's the result. In blue, we have the results of the expert ranking, and in red, we have the results of the algorithmic ranking. And there are 2 cases, Use Canon and Solhint, where the expert ranking and the community ranking really differed. And these are the 2 projects. Use Canon received 71 optimism tokens based on the metrics-based algorithm, even though the expert put it on ranking position 3, so very high in the ranking. And Solhint received 162 OP tokens, so it was overvalued by the algorithm compared to the expert ranking, who put it on position 10. Now, in a nutshell, the reason is that, number one, the algorithm really measured TVL, users. And if we look at these numbers at the lower end of these screenshots, we see that, for example, gas consumed, which was one of the metrics in the algorithm, was 10 kETH, while gas consumed by UseCanon was 1 kETH. So there's really a difference. And in this sense, Solhint really deserves more grants funding. And on the other hand, if we look at the expert ranking, we can find that UseCanon was put very high from experts who really depend on particular niche applications and tools, which UseCanon can be considered one, a very niche but very important tools for a couple few users, while the Solhint is rather a tool that is much more widely used, has a broader user base, and due to this usage has much more gas consumed. And just one of the results, so metrics-based voting is something that really reflects the preference of voters well, and this combination of metrics. We have very clear and transparent decision criteria. So traditionally, retroactive funding mechanisms are often criticized for lacking clear evaluation criteria. Here we know which metrics are in use, how is the combination and weighting of metrics, and we have a formal specification of the evaluation metrics. And voters know exactly what achievements are being measured in the voting. We can scale decision making, because we can decouple the value judgment from performance validation. And this is important also when it comes to bandwidth of voters, because most of the general purpose of an ecosystem doesn't change over time. It remains stable as a reflection of long-term community goals, while the metrics and the achievements of projects can really change and vary widely over time. And this decoupling helps also to lower the attention and burden for voters, since they vote on what is relevant, what metrics are relevant for our ecosystem. And we have this asynchronous coordination. We can use real-time or longitudinal data to calculate the rewards for projects. We can use statistical tools, scoring, smoothing, to ensure that the systems ongoingly, month by month, for example, adapts to change. And this makes this metrics-based funding very well suited for fast-moving ecosystems where the project contributions evolve swiftly, while the purpose and the objectives of an ecosystem remain relatively stable. So I think I'll close here. Don't know if we have any final questions.
Yes, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are at time right now. If any questions, I'll forward them to you and we can answer them on Twitter or chat. Next up, we have Kenneth from Mercy Corps Ventures sharing about crypto for good and high impact projects in South. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. I hope my sound is coming through. So let me just see if I can share my slides here. Share my screen. Okay. Hope this works. So yeah, I'm Ken. I'm from Mercy Corps Ventures. I lead the Crypto for Good Fund. And that's where we use Web3 to test out financial inclusion solutions in emerging markets. And so we've been running this fund for, that's just me, not quite that accurate of depiction, but gives you an idea. But yeah, it's we've been running this fund for 4 years, and this just gives you a very high level overview of what we've achieved over those 4 years. And what I wanted to just go over in this brief presentation, two areas. One is just to share some of the cross ecosystem learnings that we've had, just based off of the different proposals we received. So over the course of 4 years, we've looked at about 1,000 proposals that are just building Web3 solutions for emerging markets. Of those, we've chosen about the top 2 to 3% to pilot with. So that's the 20 pilots that you see here. And then we've deployed about close to $3 million now across 10 countries. So that's the first element that I just wanted to look at, just to see, what are people building, and then how can that help builders think about, how they position themselves when they're applying for grant funding. And then the other element is just around impact measurement, which I know is the other theme of this event. And so here's where we can just talk about some of the metrics that we track as a way to see, is this product actually advancing financial inclusion or societal impact in a meaningful way? And so I can share a bit more around how we do that with a few case studies. So yeah, just Crypto for Good Fund. So these are some of the regions that we work in. So as you'll see, it's all across emerging markets, so Latin America, Africa, Middle East, and Asia. And so yeah, just to give you an idea as to where we see a lot of activity, you can see that a lot of the builders are coming from Africa. And so we get about 60% of our general pipeline just from different parts of Africa, and then 15% from LATAM, and then about 10% from Asia. And then just a bit more breakdown on the next slide that I'll just quickly show here. So Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda are the top 3. Then it goes into a bit more, then it gets a bit more distributed after that. But as you can see, a lot of Africa, it does align relatively closely, I would say, not quite as much this year, but years past, it did rank quite, it correlated quite strongly with Chainalysis' geography of crypto ranking, where you'd see like, I think it was 7 of the top 10 appeared in both lists. So you do see a fair bit of crypto activity in those markets, but then, this is just, I think, for the builder community to think about, where is there, like, maybe you're coming from a market that's less represented, and that's a good way to differentiate yourselves. Or if you're in a market that is maybe more overrepresented, then like, how do you make partnerships, or how do you stand out a bit more so that you can advance the growth and tap into a more mature ecosystem. In terms of use cases, so we see a lot of DeFi, ReFi projects come through. We also see a lot of humanitarian aid delivery solutions. Real world asset and asset tokenization, that's become a lot more trendy, as you'd expect, over the last 2 years. Ramps was a popular one for some while as well. So yeah, these are just like, high level, some of the top use cases that were coming across our desk. And then just the last slide on data. I think, the chain wars are hopefully ending at some point. But as you can see here, like, the builders everyone's building on multiple chains. You can see, obviously, the top chains are the EVM solutions, as you'd expect. All the various L2s, like the super chain, is all very well represented here. And then you have, like, the usual suspects as well, like the Solanas, BNBs, Stellars. But the main, I would say, takeaway is that you do have builders planning to launch on like at least 2 chains, if not more. So it's a really it's clear that the future is multi-chain, cross-chain, and so I think from an operator builder perspective, just identify those few chains that you're most bullish on, and be strategic about that. And there's actually a lot more data. If you're interested, just check out the data. It's all here on this page. On this page. It's on our website, and so you can just see a bunch of stuff on here. There's deep dives, and there's country profiles, use case profiles. So that's where you can find more information. So that's part 1, and then part 2. Just wanted to share on 2 case studies how we some like details on how we measure impact. So one thing that we had done in Cameroon with our portfolio company Ijara, we supported them in tokenizing government bonds and using those as a savings product for low-income individuals. So this is a country that has relatively high inflation, but not very many options for yield-bearing savings products for lower-income individuals. So typically, your options are like keep it in cash and like under the mattress, or put it in the tontine, like a rotating savings group, where you're, not earning any interest in either case. And then you have the safety risk, and then you have liquidity issues in terms of getting that. And so what this team did was they purchased government bonds, and then they were tokenizing and fractionalizing them, such that rather than the government bond, the minimum purchase price is roughly about $2,000 but they fractionalized it down to $2, and therefore anyone could, or most people could, afford it. And then it would yield anywhere from 5 to 7%, like whatever the government was paying out. And then people now have access to a savings product. And it's digital, so it means you don't have to carry around cash or go back and forth to the bank. Made it really easy for people to do this. And so when we did our impact measurement at the end of the study, so first of all, before the product launches, we work to define the impact KPIs, right? We want to make sure that we know what we're looking for before we launch the product, because you got to make sure you do that prospectively. And then once the measurement period was over, we brought in an external team to conduct the research. So we worked with 60 Decibels on this one, which is a lean data impact study firm. And they, as an objective third party, came and spoke with a lot of users and conducted a survey to understand how did this product resonate and work, and what sort of impact it generated for the people who are accessing this product. And so in total, 11,000 people opted into this product or bought into this product, and saving about $250,000. Those numbers have both more than doubled since this period. And I think one of the more important metrics here is around access. And so, for example, in the survey, we were asking, have you previously accessed a savings product before? And 46% of people had said that this was their first time accessing such a savings product. And then, things like asking around their control over their finances, their financial security, and how they felt around financial planning. And so we were able to dive into those metrics as well through focus groups, through survey data, to understand, how is this product making a difference in people's livelihoods? And so this is a way that we were trying to go beyond like the top line numbers, which I think are, it's always great to have the top line numbers because they do give you an impression of scale and reach. But then, of course, going a bit deeper to understand, like, what's that lasting impact, the depth of the impact or the scale of that impact, so that, you can understand if this is a worthwhile thing to scale up. So that's one case study. And then second one is around how we've been using stablecoins for climate disasters or to respond to climate disasters. And in this case, it's anticipatory response, meaning before the disaster strikes, we are providing aid so that people can use the money to invest in their resilience. And it's just like, prevention is better than the cure, right? Or the treatment, whatever that saying is. If you can give someone $1 today versus $1 after they've already, seen their house get destroyed or their livestock get, blown away, the data clearly shows that it's a 7-to-1 ROI by doing it preemptively. And so anticipatory action is an area that we've been quite we've been working a lot in it over the past few years, because smart contracts and digital currencies give you a perfect platform and vehicle to disperse money quickly and cheaply to people, which has been a missing link in terms of humanitarian response. And so by tapping into this new tech, you can really overhaul the way that humanitarian aid delivery works. So we were doing this. This was in a few counties in Kenya, working with local multi-finances and off-ramp to provide aid when we saw that a drought was coming. And if a drought was coming, then we could trigger a payment directly to someone's wallet, so that way they can buy supplies for their livestock, for their farm, buy food, buy water, prepare for the drought. So that way, when the drought does hit, they're in a better position. And similarly, we were able to conduct this pilot, and then with our research partner, in this case, we worked with the Crypto Council for Innovation. So again, a third-party research firm focused on identifying, what are the true impacts of doing one of these studies or doing one of these pilot projects. We could understand, how does this improve one's resilience to climate shocks and financial resilience as well. And so, obviously you have like the top line metrics, which are around the reduction in transaction costs. So obviously it's cheaper to send stable coins than to go through the traditional banking sector. And then it's also faster, right? Because you're not settling through multiple banks, rather just smart contracts, peer-to-peer, much quicker of a process. But on top of that, you can see how across a variety of metrics, how the people who were benefiting from this program, how they felt more climate resilient, how they felt greater financial stress relief. And therefore it allowed them to, prepare better for these climate shocks. And so by doing these sorts of studies, we're able to go a bit deeper and to see what exactly is the true impact and the outcomes of running such projects. And so that's how we've been approaching a lot of this work over the past few years. And I'll wrap up, but feel free to, of course, send me any messages if you have questions, and reach out if there's anything else. Yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Kenneth. I'm just looking out for any questions. One of them asks if these slides will be available for viewing later. Since this was being recorded, you can view the slides over. I'll be sure to put the timestamps down. And yeah, you can do. Or if Kenneth, if you're okay with sharing the slides, maybe you can put them down in the comments, if it's okay.
Yeah,
totally
please feel free. I don't think I can add it, but I mean, if you have the ability to, I just put it. Yeah, feel free to just share it.
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much. And I'll be sure to put the slides up. Next up, we have Rohit from Open Source Observer sharing about the data-driven framework, data-driven retrospective framework. Thank you. Take it away, Rohit.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for the MetaGov team for having me here. I'm hoping the screen slide share is coming through as well. My name is Rohit Malekar. Before I go on, a quick shout out to the Mercy Corps team. I was fortunate enough to witness one of the grantee work happening right in the backyard of Bangalore, where I'm based out of, where the Atlantis team ran a project for water conservation using crypto as an affordances. And it was beautiful to see crypto being taken by various teams to real world impact. Thanks again for MetaGov team for having me here. Today, I'm going to talk about the role of data in shaping the future of grant design. As a quick introduction about me, my name is Rohit. I'm a contributor doing data wrangling at Open Source Observer. In my previous role, I was a writer at Gitcoin. I got introduced to Web3 about 3 years ago. And one of the things that excited me most was all of this new design space and tech affordances that crypto could now make possible, especially as it relates to participatory design and collective decision making, which is what makes me excited about this space, because capital allocation as a public goods problem is really fascinating, and that's what we will dive in the rest of the session today. Before I talk about the takeaways, I really want to go back to the very first session earlier today, where Mike introduced the concept of using evidence-driven decision-making in our Web3 ecosystems. And for those of you who didn't see the picture, it was basically a pyramid that started with wisdom at the top, driven by knowledge, informed by information, and at the bottom of the pyramid was data. So this session is a lot about that bottom of the pyramid and how we can use data to make more informed decisions, eliminate opportunity costs for running our grant programs. One of the caveats that I would like to throw in is, as we all know, capital allocation is a huge design space. I mean, even if we take quadratic funding as an example, I think between the talks yesterday, when Joel shared about how Gitcoin implemented CoQF, all the way, I think it was Robbie from the endowment team who shared the use of passive QF, the possibilities and the level of fine-grained control that we can have in a lot of these programs is really massive, which also means that any kind of frameworks or playbooks are really have a very limited shelf life. So that's the lens I would encourage everyone to have for this session. A lot of the examples and the frameworks are exploratory in nature rather than being prescriptive. And my hope at the end of the day is if each one of you can walk away with one new line of inquiry that you would want to have about your favorite grant program, and that can be solved informed by data, that'll be a huge win for me. So let's dive into the topic. What I want to do is divide the idea of retroactive or retrospectives for grants really into 4 buckets, and how data can be used to do that. These are the 4 big buckets I'll be talking on. I'll be spending probably a couple of minutes on each of these, go through an example. Happy to take any questions at the end. So we're going to start with really the first important question while running a retrospective of a grant program is the effectiveness of the mechanism, or did the system really work as it was designed to? Were we able to incentivize the behaviors and actions across the ecosystems that we really wanted? And this really goes back to the fact that all mechanisms at certain level are hypotheses, they are assumptions. As an example, with quadratic funding, you really want to put bets that there is collective intelligence amongst the crowd, and can we tap into that wisdom to discover new grantees that deserve a chance. Whereas retroactive funding, you're betting on measurable impact, want to incentivize work that has produced valuable output and outcomes, and so on. And so retrospective is really that opportunity where we put these assumptions for test and really see what behaviors did emerge from the choices that we made in the grant design. And more importantly, are there behaviors that were unintended and not something that you would like to avoid as you go into the next iteration of the grant. So tactically, what that means is a variety of questions. I've put a few sample in here. As an example, if you're running a quadratic funding program, the question you really want to ask the data is, to what extent were new projects surfaced through the collective intelligence of the donors? And one of the examples that we saw yesterday with CoQF was really digging into the donor clusters and figuring out which projects deserve an extra increment of the funding pool because their donor base is highly diverse. And that's a great example of using data to continue to fine-tune how capital gets allocated. Another similar example, especially in context of retroactive voting, I think some of you would have been batch holders, where you would have had a spectrum of experiences where in certain grant programs, you're using your judgment to allocate capital, whereas in others, you may be relying on certain metrics. And there are really signals in those decisions that get made through that batch holder voting, categorizing and creating clusters of how those decisions impacted the capital allocation. One of the themes that you'll see repeat across these four pillars of retrospectives is what value was added to the ecosystem at the end of the grant program. You can continue to start to tease that measurement by calculating some downstream usage for each project, looking at the open source repositories, and really starting to understand how experts versus community rankings differentiate, and do those signals correlate to project performance. So one example that I'd like to share here comes from the different epochs that I've run in the Octant ecosystem. I can imagine that the dashboard would be a bit hard to read, but if I have to abstract the takeaway here, what you're looking at are different clusters of projects across the different epochs that Octant ran in 2024. And by looking at the attributes of the projects, the clusters classify them in different groupings, everything from niche and growing projects all the way to mature projects versus some which are actively evolving and highly engaged on GitHub. And really a bird's eye view when you step out and look at your portfolio. It's less about how much grants individual projects receive, but if you have longitudinal data across multiple grant lifecycle, you can now start to look at, were we able to balance allocation across different types of projects? Are there gaps in funding? Are there opportunities that we were not able to look into? Both the code and the interactive data app are available in the link here. Happy to share the slides if you're interested in this topic and want to continue to dive into it. So I'll keep moving. The second and the most obvious category of retrospective is the grantee trajectory. I think we've had multiple sessions talking about how do we capture impact. And really the question here is, to what extent did the grant change the curve, the life cycle of the project? Were we able to create long-lasting value? And if so, how do we measure that? And here are a few examples. Again, depending on the context and the nature of the grant program, some may be more relevant than others. I think one of my favorite topics here that I'd like to highlight is to what extent did the grant help out the early round project? So if you monitor the trajectory of the project 6 to 12 months out after the grant was given, how does that factor in? What kind of activity are we able to observe? Was the project able to retain contributors? Were they able to add new contributors? How long did it take for the project to get to the first measurable output? I think these are some of the inquiries that you can start using the data. Again, the data won't, no dashboard alone will be able to answer enough questions, but the hope is that it will help improve the quality of the questions that we are asking once you start looking at some of the GitHub activity across these projects. So one example that I'd like to highlight here, and again, it may be a little bit hard to read here, but this is a cross-section of different projects as measured on the y-axis by a development activity index. And on the x-axis, you have the number of on-chain transactions by the same project. Now, we all know that individual GitHub metrics are fairly easy to game when it comes to commits or number of issues closed. What the advantage here on the y-axis by creating a composite index, which is a combination of different signals that you could capture from the development activity of a team, you can abstract and sort of reduce some of the noise that may come from gamifying individual metrics. So any projects that's ranking high on the y-axis here has some good signals on development velocity. And now you can correlate that to their on-chain impact as well in terms of adoption. So someone who is obviously in the top right quadrant is doing well in terms of their development velocity, but also able to attract adoption. And as a grant manager, where you can specifically start to zoom in are projects that may be in the bottom left corner, where there's low development velocity, you don't see much adoption on-chain either, and that could be a starting point for your line of inquiry to really dig into more details about the project. So as you can see, the pattern here is that no single dashboard is able to answer all the questions, but hopefully looking at the right cross-section of the data and the right attributes, you're able to ask more better questions of the grant program. I'll continue moving to the third category, which is the funding efficiency. And this is one of my favorite topics. Really what we're asking is that how hard did we put the dollar to work? And this is about moving away from the absolute totals and starting to look at the cross-section of proportions and normalizing team sizes and looking at compounding effects of the investments that were done. And so what you're really asking is, we know that grant allocation often follows power laws, but once you add normalization and look at team sizes, are you able to spot outliers where smaller teams with smaller funding are still able to do more outsized impact than some of the more incumbent projects? And yeah, so these are the questions that you can start to ask of the allocation that's been happening. And really what you're trying to figure out here is that is every dollar that you invested, is that able to attract more dollar from the grantees? One example here that I'd like to put is from the recent Gitcoin retro funding round that ran for GG23. As a quick context, there were 30 curated projects that were part of this retroactive funding allocation. And rather than looking at how the allocations fared by individual projects, what we're trying to do here is create clusters of projects within those 30 portfolio of projects and see patterns that might highlight what kind of projects are attracting more funding versus others. So as an example here on the x-axis, you'll see allocations across a spectrum of projects. This round had everything between infrastructure projects all the way to consumer apps. And we were able to classify them in terms of projects that may be really niche, have a very strong donor base versus early stage, small team sizes versus high growth projects that are high development velocity on GitHub. And what you will see here is once you start to categorize your grantees into these clusters, there's a fairly well balanced distribution of the funding across these different clusters, whether you measure it as an average grant amount per project or what share of funding each cluster attracted. So just adding an additional element in clustering these projects gives you another lens to look at how well balanced was your capital allocation. The last category I'll talk about is the ecosystem impact, and this is the hardest one to measure. And this is really about finding those outlier projects in your portfolio that have the potential to become keystone, where they end up creating new infrastructure, creating standards that get adopted across the ecosystem and create new Schelling points for the community to come together. And one of the ways to do that for open source projects is really understanding the network dependencies and the kind of projects that continue to consume packages that your grantees might have been creating. And the question really here is which projects are the most critical, which if were to shut down tomorrow would cause the most disruption. And as I said, this is the one that's hardest to track in quantified data. So alongside measuring your network dependencies and what kind of critical packages that the projects have been developing, you may also want to look at some of the qualitative data sets in terms of new standards, governance patterns, and practices that the project encourage that the rest of the ecosystem is able to follow. And again, one example here, this is a portfolio of projects from the Arbitrum Stylus sprint. The GIF may be a little bit hard to track on the screen share, but what's happening here is that you're able to drill down into individual projects that you would have offered grants to, see the spectrum, the different packages each of those projects have created, and then see the downstream footprint by understanding which downstream projects are using those packages. And this is really scratching the surface of the network analysis. You can continue to now then start asking questions, which, since no two dependencies are same, which of these are more critical than others? What are the kind of downstream developer retention each of these packages have been able to at least spur? And you'll start to get much more richer data as you drill down into that relationship. So as just to wrap up, Retrospective is really an opportunity, and the 4 categories that I shared here have enough data that's available across the different types of capital allocation mechanism to start really asking the questions that can help us inform refinements into the mechanisms, continue to recalibrate how the grants are designed, and continue to attract the right portfolio of projects as you go from one grant to the next. That's all I had to share. If you are interested in digging into the data, I've shared the link to the open source observer website. Happy to share the code and the individual dashboards as well. If you have a grant program where some of this was relevant, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or email as well. Thanks again.
Hey, Rashmi, I think you're muted.
Oh gosh. I'll repeat. Thank you so much, Rohit. And next up we have Ben for closing remarks. Take it away, Ben. Thank you.
Thanks. Can I share? Oh, yeah, perfect. All right, it's been 2 long days, but we've heard so many interesting talks, so many interesting conversations, fireside chats, panels. That's been great. And I just wanted to take the time to thank everyone who was involved organizing this. I think, working with all the tech in the back and getting everyone up to speed worked really, really well. And I just hope that everyone joining in from online, from all over the world, had 2 informative and good days. Now, I did prepare a couple of stats because this is our first virtual grant summit. And we had around about 266 attendees sign up. We had 24 speakers. Yesterday, we peaked at about 2,000 viewers. And for 8 hours of programming, this has been really, really great. Now, with all of this wrapping up, I just also wanted to take some time to tell you what's next for GIL. So with all this input that we've gathered, both from applicants who were applying to speak, but also from the speakers we've heard over the last 2 days, and everyone commenting and responding on X and elsewhere. We'll take some time and incorporate that into our reports that we're working on, new initiatives. If you have any more detail on Web3 grants programs, pre-funding, things that you think we should really be looking at, then you can just go to Grants Innovation Lab by MetaGov, and perhaps we can drop a link to that in the comments. And with this, we can then go back and really process the findings and all the inputs into new interesting programming in the future. I think some of us are heading to Argentina in fall, and I think with everything going on around DevConnect, we'll also come back with some more programming in IOL. Perhaps this is just a tease. We haven't actually anything on the docket yet, but thoughts are there, and we would love to have you there as well. So with this, I'll just want to close here. Thank you everyone for joining in. Thank you everyone for organizing behind the scenes. Thank you to Octant for supporting us with all the technical and design aspects of the 2025 Grant Summit. And a big shout out to Joshua, who's been a stellar intern and actually a key figure in organizing all of this and holding us accountable to making this work for all of you. With this, thanks again. We hope to see you soon. Thank you for joining in. Please do feel free to share slides, screenshots, impressions, and yeah, let's keep in touch. Thank you very much.